Number 1. Ted Bundy, the charming predator who terrorized a nation. Theodore Robert Bundy was born on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont, into circumstances that would, in retrospect, seem almost prophetically troubled. He was the illegitimate son of Eleanor Louise Cowell, a young woman who, in the social climate of the late 1940s, was pressured by her deeply religious family to conceal the shame of an out-of-wedlock birth. For the first years of his life, Ted was raised to believe that his grandparents were his parents and that his biological mother was actually his older sister, a deception that Ted himself would later claim left a profound mark on his psychological development. His grandfather, Samuel Cowell, was by many accounts a violent and domineering man who terrorized his family, kept a collection of pornographic materials, and was known in the community for his explosive temper and cruelty toward animals, a detail that, when viewed through the lens of what Ted Bundy would become, feels deeply significant. As a young child, Ted demonstrated early signs of an unsettling fascination with violence and the macabre. His Aunt Julia, who was only a few years older than Ted, recalled waking one morning to find herself surrounded by knives that had been removed from the kitchen, with a young Ted standing nearby, smiling. This incident, though dismissed at the time as childish curiosity, would later be revisited by investigators and psychologists as a possible early indicator of the darkness already taking root inside him. When Ted was 4 years old, Eleanor moved with him to Tacoma, Washington, where she eventually met and married Johnny Culpepper Bundy, a hospital cook who adopted Ted and gave him the surname he would make infamous. By all outward appearances, Ted Bundy grew up in a stable, working-class household in the Pacific Northwest. He was an intelligent child who excelled academically, was active in his church, and was admired by neighbors and teachers for his politeness and charm. But beneath that carefully maintained surface, something was already profoundly wrong. As a teenager, Ted began exhibiting behaviors that, in isolation, might have seemed like adolescent eccentricity, but collectively pointed toward a developing predatory psychology. He was a voyeur who prowled neighborhoods at night peering into windows, a habit he later admitted began in his early teenage years and gave him a thrill that he found difficult to explain or suppress. He was also, by his own admission, becoming increasingly drawn to violent pornography, which he would later claim in interviews played a significant role in shaping his sexual fantasies and, ultimately, his crimes. He attended the University of Washington, where he studied Chinese and later psychology, and where he fell deeply in love with a wealthy, sophisticated young woman from California whose name has been reported in various sources as Stephanie Brooks. She was everything Ted aspired to be, well-educated, socially polished, and from a privileged background, and her eventual decision to break off their relationship because she found him directionless and lacking ambition reportedly devastated him in a way that he never fully processed or recovered from. Investigators and psychologists who later studied Bundy's case have suggested that this rejection catalyzed something within him, hardening resentment toward women, particularly women who resembled Stephanie Brooks, young, attractive, with long dark hair parted in the middle, that would eventually manifest in catastrophic violence. After the breakup, Ted reinvented himself. He re-enrolled in college, this time at the University of Washington studying psychology, became involved in Republican Party politics in Washington state, worked at a suicide crisis hotline where he was regarded by colleagues as empathetic and effective, and eventually gained the admiration of respected figures in the legal and political communities who wrote him glowing letters of recommendation for law school. To everyone around him, Ted Bundy appeared to be a young man of enormous promise. But by 1974, the killings had already begun. The first confirmed victim linked to Ted Bundy in Washington state was Linda and Healy, a 21-year-old University of Washington student who vanished from her basement bedroom near the campus on the night of February 1st, 1974. Her roommates discovered the next morning that her bed linens were soaked with blood, that her nightgown had been carefully folded and placed beneath her pillow, and that Linda herself was simply gone. Investigators were baffled. There were no signs of forced entry, no obvious struggle beyond the blood-soaked mattress, and no witnesses. It was as though she had simply ceased to exist. Over the following months, more young women vanished from the Pacific Northwest with terrifying regularity. Donna Gail Manson, a 19-year-old student at Evergreen State College, disappeared on March 12, 1974, while walking to a jazz concert on campus. Susan Elaine Rancourt, 18 years old and a student at Central Washington State College, vanished on April 17, 1974, after leaving a meeting on campus. Roberta Kathleen Parks, 20 years old and a student at Oregon State University, disappeared on May 6, 1974. Brenda Carol Ball, 22 years old, vanished from the Flame Tavern in Burien, Washington, on June 1, 1974. George Ann Hawkins, an 18-year-old University of Washington student, disappeared from an alley behind her sorority house on June 11, 1974. The disappearances were occurring with an almost rhythmic frequency, and law enforcement agencies across the Pacific Northwest were beginning to recognize, with mounting dread, that they might be dealing with a single predator of extraordinary cunning and boldness. The defining moment that transformed public awareness and police focus came on July 14, 1974, at Lake Sammamish State Park in Issaquah, Washington, where two young women, Janice Annott and Denise Marie Naslund, vanished in broad daylight from a crowded public beach. Multiple witnesses came forward to describe a handsome, clean-cut young man with his arm in a sling who had approached several women at the park that day, introduced himself as Ted, and asked for help launching his sailboat. Janice had agreed to help him and was never seen alive again. Hours later, Denise Naslund also disappeared. The composite sketches generated from witness descriptions produce an image of a conventionally attractive young man, well-groomed, approachable, and entirely ordinary in appearance, which only deepened the terror, because it meant that the predator hunting the women of the Pacific Northwest looked like someone's neighbor, someone's boyfriend, someone's son. And that, of course, was precisely what made Ted Bundy so extraordinarily dangerous. As the investigation in Washington intensified, Bundy relocated to Salt Lake City, Utah, in September 1974, where he had enrolled in the University of Utah Law School, and the killings continued without interruption. Nancy Wilcox disappeared on October 2, 1974. Melissa Ann Smith, the 17-year-old daughter of a local police chief, vanished on October 18, 1974, and her body was found 9 days later in the mountains above Salt Lake City, bearing evidence of sexual assault and strangulation. Laura Annam, 17 years old, disappeared on October 31, 1974. Carol Duranch, 18 years old, was approached by a man identifying himself as Officer Roseland in a Murray, Utah, shopping mall on November 8, 1974, who told her that someone had attempted to break into her car and asked her to accompany him to verify whether anything had been stolen. She got into his Volkswagen Beetle, and within minutes he had snapped a handcuff onto her wrist and attacked her with a crowbar. In a moment of desperate courage, she managed to throw open the car door and escape onto the street, flagging down a passing vehicle. Her description of her attacker and the handcuffs still dangling from her wrist would prove to be among the most important evidence in the entire investigation. Deborah Jean Kent, 17 years old, disappeared later that same evening from a high school in Bountiful, Utah. In January 1975, Bundy traveled to Aspen, Colorado, where he abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered Karen Eileen Campbell, 23 years old, at the Wildwood Inn. More murders in Colorado followed. Julie Cunningham in March, Denise Oliverson in April, Melanie Cooley in April, Shelley Robertson in July, as investigators in 3 states struggled independently to connect the dots of a killing spree that was astonishing in both its geographic scope and its apparent immunity to detection. The breakthrough came on August 16, 1975, when Utah Highway Patrol Trooper Bob Hayward spotted a Volkswagen Beetle driving, without its headlights, in a residential neighborhood of Granger, Utah, in the early morning hours. When the driver fled at high speed upon seeing the patrol car's lights and was eventually pulled over, the trooper found himself face to face with a polite, articulate young law student named Ted Bundy. A search of the vehicle revealed a ski mask, a crowbar, handcuffs, rope, an ice pick, and a torn pair of pantyhose. Items that, taken together, constituted what investigators immediately recognized as a kidnapping and murder kit. Bundy was arrested on suspicion of burglary. When Carol Duranch was shown a lineup, she identified Bundy without hesitation as the man who had attacked her, and in March 1976, he was convicted of aggravated kidnapping and sentenced to 1 to 15 years in Utah State Prison. But law enforcement in Colorado had also been building a case against him for the murders there, and in January 1977, he was transferred to Aspen, Colorado, to stand trial for the murder of Karen Campbell. What followed was one of the most remarkable and, in its ultimate consequences, most catastrophic sequences of events in American criminal justice history. On June 7, 1977, Bundy was allowed to visit the Pitkin County Courthouse Law Library without handcuffs or shackles as part of his own legal representation, and he exploited this extraordinary lapse in security to leap from a second-floor window and flee into the mountains surrounding Aspen. He evaded a massive manhunt for 6 days before being recaptured. Astonishingly, less than 6 months later, on December 30th, 1977, Bundy escaped again from the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, this time by carefully reducing his body weight over several weeks so they could squeeze through a hole he had cut in the ceiling of his cell. He dropped into the apartment of the chief jailer, who was out for the evening with his wife, changed into civilian clothes from the jailer's wardrobe, walked out of the building, stole a car, and vanished. It took jail officials 15 hours to notice he was gone. By the time the alarm was raised, Ted Bundy was already heading east, and he would not be captured again for 32 days, days during which he committed the most frenzied and savage crimes of his entire murderous career. On the night of January 14th to 15th, 1978, Bundy broke into Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University in Tallahassee, and, in a period of approximately 15 minutes, attacked 4 sleeping women with a piece of oak firewood, bludgeoning and strangling them with a ferocity that shocked even experienced homicide investigators. Margaret Bowman, 21 years old, and Lisa Levy, 20 years old, died from their injuries. Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner survived, but sustained severe injuries. Within hours, Bundy attacked another woman in a separate apartment a few blocks away, leaving her with a fractured skull and a broken jaw. 3 weeks later, on February 9th, 1978, he abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered 12-year-old Kimberly Diane Leach in Lake City, Florida, his youngest known victim and, by virtually all accounts, the crime that sealed his fate. On February 15th, 1978, a Pensacola police officer named David Lee ran the plates on a slowly moving Volkswagen in the early morning hours and discovered the car was stolen. When he attempted to arrest the driver, the man fled on foot before being subdued. The man gave a false name but was eventually identified as Theodore Robert Bundy, and his extraordinary reign of terror was finally, definitively over. The trials that followed were televised nationally and became, in many ways, the template for the modern true crime media phenomenon. Bundy, displaying a narcissism and grandiosity that stunned observers, chose to represent himself in the Chi Omega murder trial, cross-examining witnesses and making legal arguments before a court that was simultaneously horrified by his crimes and fascinated by his performance. The prosecution's case was anchored by one of the most compelling pieces of physical evidence in the history of forensic science. Bite mark evidence found on the body of Lisa Levy that was matched by forensic odontologist Dr. Richard Suverin to a dental impression taken from Bundy's own mouth. The match was described by experts as definitive, and combined with eyewitness testimony and fiber evidence, it was devastating. On July 24, 1979, the jury found Ted Bundy guilty of the murders of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, as well as the attempted murders of Karen Chandler, Kathy Kleiner, and Cheryl Thomas. He was sentenced to death in the electric chair. A separate trial for the murder of Kimberly Leach resulted in a second death sentence in February 1980. Over the following decade, Bundy pursued a seemingly endless series of appeals, confessing to murder strategically and in installments in an apparent effort to delay his execution by offering information to investigators hoping to close cold cases. In conversations with FBI agent William Hagmeyer and Detective Robert Keppel, Bundy described in chilling detail mechanics of his crimes, discussing his victims not as human beings but as objects, and revealing a psychological architecture of such profound depravity that the investigators who spoke with him at length described the experience as deeply disturbing even by the standards of their careers. He ultimately confessed to 30 murders in 7 states between 1974 and 1978, though investigators have long believed the actual number was significantly higher, with some estimates suggesting it may have exceeded 100. His confessions, made in the final days before his execution, were notable for their clinical detachment and for the almost aesthetic language Bundy used to describe his crimes, language that reinforced what criminal psychologists had long argued, that Ted Bundy was among the most sophisticated and self-aware psychopaths ever studied. On January 24, 1989, at 7:16 in the morning, Theodore Robert Bundy was executed by electric chair at Florida State Prison in Stark, Florida. He was 42 years old. Outside the prison, crowds gathered to cheer, to wave signs, and to celebrate the death of a man who, for over a decade, represented the most terrifying possible face of evil: handsome, intelligent, articulate, and utterly without conscience. The crowds outside the prison on the morning of his execution numbered in the hundreds, some having driven to the night from distant states, and their celebration reflected the depth of the collective trauma that Bundy's crimes had inflicted on the American public. The forensic and investigative legacy of the Bundy case is enormous and enduring. His crimes directly contributed to the development of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit's criminal profiling methodology, to the creation of the National Violent Crime Apprehension Program, and to significant reforms in interagency communication and information sharing in criminal investigations. The bite mark evidence used in his conviction helped establish forensic odontology as a recognized discipline in American courts. His interviews with FBI agents and investigators became foundational texts in the study of criminal psychology, and the profiling techniques developed in part through the analysis of his crimes are still taught in law enforcement academies around the world. The victims of Ted Bundy, young women whose lives were stolen by a man who regarded them as objects, deserve to be remembered not as footnotes in the story of a famous killer, but as human beings. Students, daughters, sisters, and friends whose futures were taken from them in acts of incomprehensible cruelty. Linda Healy wanted to be a pediatric therapist. George Ann Hawkins was a popular, vivacious sorority member who disappeared from a well-lit alley while walking 50 yards between two buildings. Kimberly Leach was 12 years old and had simply stepped outside her school during a break. Each of them had a life, a future, and people who loved them, and the magnitude of what was lost when Ted Bundy chose his path of destruction cannot be measured in the clinical language of criminal justice. It can only be measured in the decades of grief that followed. Number 2, John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown who buried his victims beneath his own home. John Wayne Gacy Jr. was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, the second of 3 children born to John Wayne Gacy Sr. and Marion Elaine Robinson. From the outside, the Gacy household on the northwest side of Chicago appeared to be a typical working-class Catholic family navigating the post-war American dream with modest but genuine ambition. But behind the closed doors of that household, the atmosphere was defined largely by the towering, volatile, and deeply cruel presence of John Gacy Sr., a man whose alcoholism and emotional brutality cast a long shadow over every member of the family, and who reserved a particular and vicious contempt for his son John, whom he regarded as weak, effeminate, and a disappointment. John Sr. beat his children with a razor strap, belittled his son in front of others, called him a sissy and a mama's boy, and expressed an open preference for his daughters that left young John Jr. in a perpetual state of desperate, unachievable longing for his father's approval, a longing that, according to psychologists who later studied him extensively, became one of the most formative and destructive psychological forces of his life. Despite the cruelty of his home environment, John Gacy Jr. presented to the outside world as an eager, sociable, and industrious child who wanted desperately to be liked and to be seen as successful. He was involved in school activities, was known among neighbors as a helpful and friendly boy, and demonstrated from a young age a talent for salesmanship and social performance that would serve him throughout his adult life in ways both legitimate and catastrophically sinister. However, his childhood was also marked by significant medical difficulties. At the age of 11, he was struck on the head by a swing, resulting in a blood clot on the brain that caused periodic blackouts throughout his adolescence and young adulthood, a condition that went undiagnosed and untreated for years. He also suffered from a heart condition that prevented him from participating fully in the physical activities that might have earned him his father's respect, and a combination of medical vulnerability and paternal rejection created in him a psychological wound that never properly healed. Gacy dropped out of high school and, after a period of drifting, eventually found his footing in the business world. He worked as a management trainee for a shoe company and proved to be an exceptionally capable and driven employee, eventually marrying a co-worker named Marlyn Myers in 1964 and relocated with her to Waterloo, Iowa, where he managed a chain of Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants owned by his father-in-law. In Waterloo, Gacy constructed the first version of what would become his defining social persona, the energetic, larger-than-life community figure who was everywhere at once, who knew everyone, who volunteered for everything, and who projected an image of relentless bonhomie and civic engagement. He joined the JCs, rose rapidly through its ranks, was named one of the organization's outstanding members, and built a social network that included local businessmen, politicians, and community leaders. He and Marlyn had 2 children, and by outward appearances, he was a successful young businessman and family man living the American dream in a prosperous Iowa community. But the darkness that always existed beneath Gacy's carefully constructed surface was already beginning to assert itself in ways that could no longer be contained. In 1967, Gacy was accused by a 15-year-old boy named Donald Voorhees, the son of fellow JC, of coercing him into a sexual act. Gacy initially denied the accusation, but later attempted to have Voorhees beaten by another young man to prevent him from testifying, an action that only compounded his legal jeopardy. In May 1968, Gacy was indicted by a grand jury on a charge of sodomy. He pleaded guilty and in December 1968 was sentenced to 10 years at the Iowa State Reformatory for men at Anamosa. His wife immediately filed for divorce, taking custody of their children and severing all ties with Gacy. He would never see his children again. What happened next defies easy comprehension and represents one of the most consequential failures of the American criminal justice system in the 20th century. John Wayne Gacy proved to be a model prisoner. He worked hard, demonstrated good behavior, completed his high school equivalency diploma, and so thoroughly impressed the prison administration with his apparent rehabilitation that he was paroled after serving only 18 months of his 10-year sentence in June 1970. He moved back to Chicago, moved in with his mother, found work as a cook, and within a remarkably short period had rebuilt his life with the same energy and social facility that had always characterized him. In 1971, he was arrested again in connection with complaint by a young man who alleged that Gacy had attempted to coerce him sexually, but the charges were dropped when the alleged victim failed to appear in court. No one connected this new incident to his Iowa conviction. No one alerted the parole board in Iowa. And John Wayne Gacy continued his ascent. By the mid-1970s, Gacy had established himself as a successful building contractor in the northwest Chicago suburbs, operating a company called PDM Contractors, the initials standing for painting, decorating, and maintenance, that employed a rotating workforce of young men, many of them teenagers and young adults who were drawn to the work by Gacy's generous pay and his reputation as an easygoing, generous boss. He had remarried in 1972 to a woman named Carol Hoff, who moved into his house at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue in Norwood Park Township with her 2 daughters from a previous marriage. He threw elaborate parties for neighbors and business associates, served as a precinct captain for the local Democratic Party, and organized community events with a tireless enthusiasm that made him a genuinely popular figure in his neighborhood. He even invented a clown character he called Pogo the Clown and Patches the Clown, donning a self-made clown costume performed at children's birthday parties and local charitable events, where he entertained children and charmed parents with a practiced ease that made him seem like the embodiment of community spirit. He was photographed with First Lady Rosalind Carter at a Democratic Party fundraiser in 1978, a photograph that would later become one of the most chilling images in American criminal history, its smiling subjects separated by a secret that only one of them carried. Beneath the house on Somerdale Avenue, John Wayne Gacy was building a graveyard. The precise date of Gacy's first murder in Chicago remains a subject of some uncertainty. Gacy himself gave varying accounts in his confessions, but investigators and prosecutors believe his first Chicago area victim was Timothy McCoy, a 15-year-old from Omaha, Nebraska, who was hitchhiking back home from a visit to Chicago in January 1972 and accepted a ride from Gacy. According to Gacy's own account, McCoy had come into his bedroom early in the morning carrying a kitchen knife, apparently intending to prepare breakfast, and Gacy, startled and frightened, wrestled the knife from him and stabbed him to death in what Gacy described as a panic response. Whether or not this account of accident and fear was truthful, and investigators were deeply skeptical. What is undeniable is that Gacy later described experiencing an orgasm during the killing and claimed that the experience revealed to him that death and the killing of others gave him the highest sexual gratification he had ever known. Over the following years, the killings became increasingly deliberate and increasingly frequent. Gacy developed a preferred method of luring victims, typically young men and teenage boys, many of them runaways, drifters, or young workers, into his home, where he would offer them alcohol and drugs, engage them in conversation, and then produce what he called his rope trick, a piece of rope tied into a looped knot that he would demonstrate as a trick before using it to strangle his victim. He would sometimes handcuff victims first, and in response to pleas for release would tell them, with a cold smile, that the trick was that he had the key. He strangled his victims, sometimes with rope, sometimes by hand, and on at least one occasion suffocated a victim using a piece that would press against the throat, and methodical efficiency with which he disposed of the bodies, burying them in the crawl space beneath his house, carefully covered with lime to accelerate decomposition, spoke to a mind that had fully embraced killing as a routine part of its existence. His second wife, Carol, later reported that during their marriage she had noticed a persistent and terrible smell in the house that Gacy attributed to moisture and mold in the crawl space, and that she had found items of young men's clothing in the house that Gacy offered implausible explanations for. She divorced him in 1976, and Gacy, now living alone, accelerated his killing. The employment structure of PDM contractors gave Gacy a consistent and tragically convenient supply of young men who were vulnerable, often transit, and whose disappearances were less likely to trigger immediate investigation. He paid in cash, hired workers off the street, and moved to the margins of a labor pool populated by young men who were already, in many cases, disconnected from stable family structures or permanent addresses. When these young men disappeared after encounters with Gacy, their absences often went unreported or were attributed to the itinerant nature of their lives. Gacy also frequented Bughouse Square, a park in Chicago's near North Side that was known as a gathering place for gay men and young male prostitutes, and a Greyhound bus terminal, where runaways and drifters congregated. He would offer young men money for sex or for work, drive them back to his house on Summerdale Avenue, and they would never leave. Among his victims were Robert Gilroy, 18 years old, the son of a Chicago police sergeant; John Mowry, 19 years old; Russell Nelson, 21 years old; Robert Donnelly, who survived a night of torture at Gacy's hands and reported it to police, who did nothing; and William Kindred, 19 years old, whose murder in November 1977 was one of Gacy's last. The case that ultimately unraveled everything began with a 15-year-old boy named Robert Piest, who disappeared on December 11, 1978, from a pharmacy in the Plains, Illinois, where he worked part-time. Robert had told his mother, who was waiting in the parking lot to drive him home after his shift, that he was going to speak briefly with a contractor who had offered him a job. That contractor was John Wayne Gacy. When Robert failed to return to the car, his mother went inside the pharmacy to look for him and was told he had left with a man. She reported him missing that night, and the investigation that followed moved with unusual speed because the Des Plaines police lieutenant assigned to the case, Joseph Kozenzak, took the disappearance seriously from the outset and quickly identified Gacy as the contractor who had spoken with Robert at the pharmacy. When Kozenzak ran Gacy's name through the system, he found the Iowa sodomy conviction, and whatever explanation Gacy offered for Robert Piest's whereabouts was immediately insufficient. A search of Gacy's house and vehicle recovered a pharmacy receipt belonging to Robert Piest, and investigators secured a warrant to search the property more thoroughly. On December 21, 1978, investigators searching the crawl space beneath 8213 West Summerdale Avenue found what would become one of the most horrifying discoveries in the history of American law enforcement. In the soft soil of the crawl space, beneath the very rooms where Gacy had entertained neighbors and hosted parties and played the role of the jovial community figure, were the decomposed remains of 29 young men and boys. The excavation of the crawl space took days, conducted by investigators working in difficult and deeply disturbing conditions, as each set of remains was carefully extracted and documented. The full scope of what John Wayne Gacy had done began to settle over the investigation like a fog of almost unimaginable horror. Four additional victims were eventually identified as having been thrown from bridges into the Des Plaines and Illinois rivers after Gacy ran out of space in his crawl space, bringing the confirmed total to 33. Gacy was arrested on December 21, 1978, and charged initially with one count of murder. As the excavation of his property continued and the true scale of the killings became apparent, additional charges followed rapidly. He confessed to the killings in a series of interviews, though his confessions were notable for the degree to which he sought to minimize his culpability, at various times claiming that he had no memory of many of the killings, that his employees had committed some of them, and that an alternate personality he called Bad Jack had been responsible for actions that the John Gacy who sat before investigators was not capable of. These claims were regarded by investigators, prosecutors, and ultimately the jury as transparently self-serving fabrications. The identification of Gacy's victims was a painstaking and heartbreaking process that took years. Of the 33 confirmed victims, 9 remained unidentified for decades, and it was not until advances in DNA technology were applied to the case in the 2000s and 2010s that some of these individuals were finally given names. The youngest confirmed victim was 14 years old. The oldest was in his late 20s. Many were runaways or young men living on the margins, but many others had stable homes and families who had been searching for them for years, and the identification of their remains brought decades of terrible uncertainty to a painful but necessary conclusion for their families. The trial of John Wayne Gacy began on February 6, 1980, in Cook County, Illinois, and lasted approximately 5 weeks. Gacy's defense team, led by attorneys Sam Amaran and Robert Mata, pursued an insanity defense, arguing that Gacy suffered from multiple personality disorder and was not legally responsible for the killings. They presented testimony from psychiatrists who described a man with profound psychological disorders, a fragmented identity, and a history of childhood trauma that had produced a personality structure incapable of genuine moral judgment. The prosecution countered with its own psychiatric experts, who argued that while Gacy was undoubtedly a deeply disturbed individual, he met the legal standard of sanity. He knew what he was doing. He knew it was wrong, and he took deliberate steps to conceal his crimes, which demonstrated precisely the kind of premeditation and rational planning that was incompatible with a genuine insanity defense. The prosecution also presented the testimony of Robert Donnelly, the young man who had survived a night of torture at Gacy's hands, whose account of what happened to him in a house on Summerdale Avenue, the handcuffs, the sexual assault, the systematic cruelty, gave the jury a vivid and visceral understanding of what the 33 victims who had not survived had endured. The forensic evidence was overwhelming. The physical remains recovered from the crawl space, the victim identifications, the receipt found in Gacy's car belonging to Robert Piest, and the testimony of former employees and associates who described Gacy's behavior and his habit of bringing young men back to his house at night all combined to construct a case of extraordinary prosecutorial strength. On March 12, 1980, after approximately 2 hours of deliberation, the jury found John Wayne Gacy guilty of 33 counts of first-degree murder, the most murder convictions returned against a single defendant in American history at that time. He was sentenced to death on 12 of the counts and to natural life imprisonment on the remaining 21. Gacy spent 14 years on death row at the Menard Correctional Center in Illinois, during which time he became a strange cultural phenomenon, painting clowns and self-portraits in his cell that were sold to collectors, giving interviews to journalists and authors, and maintaining the garrulous, self-promoting persona that had always been his most consistent characteristic. He insisted on his innocence to some interviewers while confessing to others, expressed self-pity at a volume that outraged the families of his victims, and seemed, to the end, more concerned with how he was perceived than with any genuine reckoning with what he had done. On May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection at the Stateville Correctional Center in Joliet, Illinois. The execution did not proceed without difficulty. A clog for a line caused an unusual delay, and Gacy's last words, delivered in a tone that observers described as defiant rather than remorseful, were reported as "kiss my ass." He was 52 years old. The legacy of John Wayne Gacy extends far beyond the horror of his crimes. His case exposed profound and systemic failures in the background check and information sharing systems that allowed a convicted sex offender to rebuild his life, his business, and his access to vulnerable young men with virtually no effective oversight. It revealed the degree to which a carefully constructed social persona could serve as an almost impenetrable shield against suspicion, and it demonstrated with terrible clarity that the monsters who commit the most heinous acts among us are not always recognizable as monsters, that they can look like neighbors, like employers, like community leaders, and like clowns entertaining children at birthday parties. The families of his victims have spent decades advocating for the complete identification of all 33 victims, and the ongoing work of DNA analysis and forensic identification that has gradually given names to the unidentified remains has been a testament to their perseverance and to the enduring importance of refusing to allow the unnamed to remain forgotten. For the families who waited years and decades to know what had happened to their sons and brothers and friends, the work of identification has brought not closure. That word always feels inadequate in the face of such loss, but something perhaps more important. The acknowledgement that their loved ones existed, that they mattered, and that the truth of what happened to them deserved to be known. Number 3, Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee monster who turned his apartment into a chamber of horrors. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21st, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the first child of Lionel Herbert Dahmer, an analytical chemist, and Joyce Annette Flitt, a teletype machine instructor. By virtually all accounts, the early years of Jeffrey Dahmer's life were outwardly unremarkable, a middle-class Midwestern childhood in a household that, while not without its difficulties, presented none of the extreme dysfunction or overt abuse that characterized the early environments of some other notorious killers. And yet, in retrospect, the people who knew Jeffrey as a child and adolescent consistently described a series of behaviors and preoccupations that, viewed through the lens of what he would eventually become, seemed to carry an almost unbearable weight of foreshadowing. Lionel Dahmer, who later wrote a deeply searching and painful memoir about his son, described Jeffrey as a happy and energetic toddler who underwent a noticeable change around the age of 4, following a hernia surgery that Jeffrey seemed to find profoundly disturbing. Whether this medical event was genuinely traumatic in a psychological sense, or whether it merely coincided with other developmental changes that would have occurred regardless remains unclear, but Lionel Dahmer noted that his son seemed less vibrant, less engaged, and more withdrawn in its aftermath. As Jeffrey grew older, his parents' marriage deteriorated steadily under the weight of Lionel's long working hours, Joyce's increasingly erratic emotional states, and a series of conflicts and separations that create a household atmosphere of persistent tension and instability. Joyce Dahmer suffered from significant mental health issues, including what appeared to be hypochondria and depression, and her behavior was at times so volatile and self-absorbed that neighbors and relatives later describe her as difficult and exhausting to be around. The marriage finally ended in divorce in 1978, when Jeffrey was 17 years old, and the manner of the divorce, bitter, chaotic, and conducted with what seemed to be almost no consideration for its effect on their son, left Jeffrey effectively alone in the family home in Bath Township, Ohio, while his mother moved away with his younger brother David, and his father relocated to a motel. Jeffrey Dahmer was left entirely by himself in a family home for several weeks, with virtually no supervision, no support structure, and no one checking on him, at precisely the moment when his already deeply troubled inner life was reaching a point of dangerous instability. By the time of his parents' divorce, Jeffrey Dahmer had already been harboring a secret inner world of extraordinary darkness for several years. From approximately the age of 14, he had been experiencing fantasies of a deeply disturbing nature. Fantasies involving dominance, control, and the possession of others. Fantasies in which the object of desire was rendered completely passive and completely available through death or incapacitation. He had become intensely preoccupied with the inside of animals, collecting roadkill, stripping the flesh from animal carcasses, and preserving the bleached bones and skulls that he kept hidden in the woods behind the family home. His father, Lionel, who was himself a chemist with professional interest in the properties of various substances, later recalled that Jeffrey had shown an early interest in chemistry and had asked questions about what various chemicals could do to animal tissue, questions that Lionel, who had no reason at the time to interpret them sinisterly, had answered helpfully and in good faith. In high school, Jeffrey Dahmer was remembered by classmates as an odd figure, a class clown of specific and unsettling variety, who performed what became known as doing a Dahmer, which involved faking seizures, spastic movements, or the behaviors of people with cerebral palsy in public places to provoke reactions from strangers. These performances, which his classmates found funny and which Jeffrey executed with a deadpan commitment that was itself somewhat unnerving, have been interpreted by psychologists as early manifestations of his fundamental detachment from normal human empathy and social connection, a way of relating to the world through performance and manipulation rather than through genuine emotional engagement. He was also, by this period, drinking heavily, smuggling alcohol into school in a bag, and consuming it throughout the school day with a regularity that suggested not recreational excess, but genuine dependency. And the alcoholism that would define and destabilize his adult life was already firmly established before he graduated high school. The summer of 1978, the summer his parents divorced and left him alone in the family home, was the summer Jeffrey Dahmer committed his first murder. Stephen Mark Hicks was an 18-year-old who was hitchhiking to a friend's house on June 18, 1978, when Dahmer picked him up in his car. Dahmer later described Hicks as exactly the kind of person he had been fantasizing about, young, attractive, and willing to come home with him. The two spent several hours together at the Dahmer house drinking beer, and when Hicks announced that he wanted to leave, Dahmer, gripped by a terror of being alone and an unwillingness to let go of someone he wanted to keep, struck him from behind with a barbell, rendered him unconscious, and strangled him to death with the barbell. He then dismembered the body, placed the remains in plastic garbage bags, and initially buried them in the backyard before later digging them up, dissolving the flesh with acid, and pulverizing the bones with a sledgehammer before scattering them in the woods behind the house. He was 18 years old and had just committed a murder of such deliberate and methodical brutality that it is almost impossible to reconcile with the image of an 18-year-old boy, and he would carry the secret of Stephen Hicks's death alone for the next 9 years. Following the murder of Stephen Hicks, Dahmer did not kill again for nearly a decade, a period of restraint that investigators and psychologists have never been entirely able to explain, though the most persuasive explanation is that Dahmer himself offered, which was that he spent those years engaged in a sustained internal struggle against his own desires, a struggle that was never fully successful and that was made considerably more difficult by his alcoholism and his growing social isolation. He attended Ohio State University for one semester in the fall of 1978, but dropped out, spending his days drinking and doing essentially nothing. His father, alarmed by his son's dissolution, pressured him to enlist in the United States Army, which he did in January 1979. He was stationed at Baumholder, West Germany, where he served as a combat medic, and his fellow soldiers later recalled that he was a capable and competent medic when sober, but that his drinking was severe and almost constant, and that there was something about him that made people instinctively uncomfortable without being able to articulate precisely why. He was discharged from the Army in March 1981 under what the military described as an honorable discharge due to his alcoholism, and after a brief and disastrous period in Florida, during which he spent most of his money on alcohol and slept on the beach, he moved to Bath Township, Ohio, before his father, increasingly desperate to provide some structure for his clearly struggling son, sent him to live with his paternal grandmother, Catherine Dahmer, in West Allis, Wisconsin, in 1982. Jeffrey Dahmer lived with his grandmother for 6 years, and during this period his behavior became increasingly erratic and troubling, though never in ways that quite broke the protective shield of his grandmother's unconditional love and his own surface-level charm and cooperativeness. He was arrested twice during this period, once in 1982 for indecent exposure at the Wisconsin State Fair, and once in 1986 for masturbating in front of 2 boys near a lakefront, for which he received a 1-year probationary sentence. But these incidents were not sufficient to trigger any serious investigation or intervention. He worked sporadically, most notably at the Ambrosia Chocolate Factory in Milwaukee, where he would work for much of the following decade, and he began visiting gay bathhouses in Milwaukee, where he developed a disturbing habit of drugging the drinks of other patrons with sleeping pills and then molesting them while they were unconscious, a behavior that eventually resulted in his being banned from the bathhouses. In September 1987, the 9-year period of restraint ended. Stephen Twomey was a 24-year-old man whom Dahmer met at a gay bar in Milwaukee and brought back to a room at the Ambassador Hotel. Dahmer later claimed that he had no memory of killing Twomey and woke the following morning to find him dead, his chest caved in and his body bearing evidence of extreme violence. Whether or not Dahmer's account of memory loss was truthful, what is certain is that he dismembered Twomey's body in the hotel room, packed the remains into a large suitcase, transported them to his grandmother's house, and disposed of them. And with the second murder, the restraint that had held for 9 years dissolved completely. Between September 1987 and the following year, Dahmer killed 3 more men. Jamie Dockstader, 14 years old, in January 1988, Richard Guerrero, 25 years old, in March 1988, and Anthony Sears, 26 years old, in March 1989. His grandmother, alarmed by the strange smells coming from the basement and by the odd hours her grandson kept, eventually asked him to find his own apartment. And in September 1988, Dahmer moved into his own apartment at 808 North 24th Street in Milwaukee, though not before a deeply troubling incident in which he was arrested for drugging and fondling a 13-year-old Laotian boy named Sintasumphone, for which he was charged with second-degree sexual assault and enticing a child for immoral purposes. He was convicted in January 1989, sentenced to 1 year in a work release program and 5 years of probation, and was required to register as a sex offender. The sentencing judge, in a decision that would later haunt the case, accepted Dahmer's attorney's argument that he was not dangerous and did not need to be incarcerated. In May 1990, Dahmer moved into apartment 213 at the Oxford Apartments, 924 North 25th Street in Milwaukee, and the apartment became, over the following 14 months, the scene of crime so grotesque and so incomprehensible that even experienced investigators, prosecutors, and journalists struggled to find language adequate to describe them. Dahmer's method had by this point become established and grimly consistent. He would meet young men, predominantly black and Hispanic gay men, a demographic whose vulnerability was compounded by the indifference with which their disappearances were treated by law enforcement, at gay bars, bathhouses, or shopping malls, and offer them money to pose for photographs or simply come back to his apartment. Once there, he would offer them a drink laced with sleeping pills, and once they were unconscious, he would strangle them. Then, alone in his apartment, he would engage in acts of necrophilia before dismembering the body, preserving various parts, skulls, which he bleached and kept, hands and genitalia, which he preserved in formaldehyde, and in some cases flesh, which he cooked and consumed. He believed, in a psychological framework of extraordinary disturbance, that by consuming parts of his victims, he was incorporating them permanently into himself, making them a permanent part of his body in a way that ensured they could never truly leave him. The refrigerator in apartment 213 contained human flesh. The freezer contained human heads. A 57-gallon barrel of acid in the bedroom was used to dissolve bodies. Photographs of dismembered body parts were stacked alongside ordinary household items. And in a blue kettle on the stove, investigators would eventually find human hands and a male genital organ that Dahmer had been in the process of cooking. The victims who died in apartment 213 included Raymond Smith, 33 years old, killed in May 1990, Edward Smith, 27 years old, killed in June 1990, Ernest Miller, 22 years old, killed in September 1990, whose skeleton Dahmer cleaned and kept, David Thomas, 23 years old, killed in September 1990, Curtis Straughter, 18 years old, killed in February 1991, Errol Lindsay, 19 years old, killed in April 1991, Tony Hughes, 31 years old and deaf-mute, killed in May 1991, Conorak Sintasumphone, 14 years old, killed in May 1991, Matt Turner, 20 years old, killed in June 1991, Jeremiah Weinberger, 23 years old, killed in June 1991, Oliver Lacey, 23 years old, killed in July 1991, and Joseph Braidhoft, 25 years old, killed in July 1991. The case of Conorak Sintasumphone, the younger brother of the boy Dahmer had been convicted of assaulting in 1988, represents perhaps the most devastating single episode in the entire history of the Dahmer case, not only for the horror of what happened to Conorak himself, but for what it revealed about the failures of the institutions that were supposed to protect vulnerable people. On May 27, 1991, 2 young women discovered Conorak Sintasumphone, 14 years old, naked, bleeding, and barely conscious, wandering the street outside Dahmer's apartment building. They called the police, and when officers arrived, Dahmer appeared and calmly told them that Conorak was his 19-year-old boyfriend who had drunk too much and that they had simply had a lover's quarrel. The officers, despite the protests of the 2 young women who had found Conorak and who insisted that something was deeply wrong, escorted Konarak back into Dahmer's apartment and left. They did not check Dahmer's identity. They did not verify the claim that Konarak was 19. They did not investigate the smell emanating from the apartment, which one of the women had described as overwhelming. Later, recordings of the officers joking about the incident over their radio were obtained by journalists and played publicly, and the outrage they generated was entirely appropriate. Konarak Sinthasumphone was murdered within minutes of the officers leaving the apartment. The end of Jeffrey Dahmer's killing came on July 22, 1991, through a combination of his own miscalculation and the extraordinary courage of a young man named Tracy Edwards, 32 years old, who had been lured back to apartment 213 and had spent several hours as Dahmer's captive, watching Dahmer slip in and out of dissociative state, holding a large knife, and watching The Exorcist 3 while pressing his head against Edwards' chest and listening to his heartbeat in a manner that Edwards found unutterably terrifying. Edwards managed to punch Dahmer, break free, and run out of the apartment with a handcuff dangling from one wrist, flagging down a Milwaukee police patrol car on the street outside. When officers Jeffrey Roth and Rolf Mueller accompanied Edwards back to apartment 213, Dahmer initially attempted to maintain his composure and explained the handcuff as part of a consensual arrangement. But when Officer Mueller went to the bedroom to retrieve the key to the handcuff, he saw the Polaroid photographs of dismembered bodies, called out to his partner, and the investigation that followed revealed the full and almost unendurable truth of what had been happening in apartment 213. Dahmer was arrested on the spot. The subsequent search of the apartment uncovered 4 severed heads in the refrigerator, 7 skulls, some painted, some bleached, in the bedroom closet, an entire torso stored in a 57-gallon barrel acid, 2 complete skeletons, preserved hands, genitalia, and a human heart in the freezer that Dahmer stated he was saving to eat later. There were photographs of dismemberment and of victims in various stages of death, and a complete catalog of human remains that represented the physical evidence of 17 murders committed over 13 years. Dahmer confessed immediately and with a thoroughness that investigators found simultaneously invaluable and deeply disturbing. He described each murder in precise clinical detail, explained his methods of disposal, identified the victims he could recall, and discussed his psychological motivations with an apparent self-awareness that was at once genuine and deeply unsettling. He described the loneliness that had driven him, the fear of abandonment that had made him unable to let his victims leave, and the escalating nature of his acts of necrophilia and cannibalism as attempts to achieve a form of permanent possession and intimacy that his fundamental inability to connect with other human beings had always denied him. The trial of Jeffrey Dahmer began in January 1992 in Milwaukee County Circuit Court. Dahmer had entered pleas of guilty but insane to 15 counts of murder, meaning that the legal question before the jury was not whether he had committed the killings. He had confessed to them in exhaustive detail, but whether, at the time of each killing, he had the mental capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law. The defense, led by attorney Gerald Boyle, argued that Dahmer suffered from a paraphilic disorder of such extreme severity that it constituted a mental disease that rendered him unable to control his behavior, that he was a profoundly ill man whose illness had never been properly recognized or treated, and that the appropriate response was commitment to a secure psychiatric facility rather than imprisonment. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Michael McCann, argued that Dahmer's extraordinary methodical cunning in luring victims, drugging them, concealing his crimes, maintaining his employment and his outward functionality, and managing the practical logistics of his apartment, while conducting murders and dismemberments demonstrated a level of rational planning and behavioral control that was entirely inconsistent with legal insanity. The jury deliberated for approximately 10 hours before returning a verdict of sane on each of the 15 counts. Jeffrey Dahmer was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms in prison, totaling 957 years, and was transferred to Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, to begin serving his sentence. There will be no parole, no appeal of substance, and no realistic prospect of release. In November 1994, less than 3 years into his sentence, Dahmer was killed by a fellow inmate, Christopher Scarver, who beat him to death with a metal bar in the prison gymnasium, along with another inmate named Jesse Anderson, on the morning of November 28, 1994. Scarver later stated that he had killed Dahmer because he was deeply offended by the nature of Dahmer's crimes, particularly the murders of children, and that he had felt compelled to act Jeffrey Dahmer was 34 years old at the time of his death. The aftermath of the Dahmer case reverberated through Milwaukee and through American society in ways that extended far beyond the immediate horror of the crimes themselves. The revelation of the failures that had allowed Dahmer to continue killing, the dismissal of the complaints about apartment 213 by neighbors who reported the smell of decomposition, the catastrophic police response to the discovery of Conorak synthesumphone in the street, the inadequacy of oversight for a convicted sex offender on probation, prompted significant and necessary conversations about the ways in which systemic indifference to the safety of marginalized communities had contributed directly to the deaths of 17 people. The predominantly black community of Milwaukee's North Side, where many of Dahmer's victims lived and from which many of them were drawn, expressed a profound and entirely legitimate anger at the manner in which police had responded to the disappearances of their family members and neighbors, an anger that was validated by the documented evidence of the synthesumphone response and by the broader pattern of investigative indifference that had characterized the response to the victims' disappearances. The families of Dahmer's victims, many of whom sat through the agonizing proceedings of his trial and were forced to hear clinical descriptions of what had been done to their loved ones, conducted themselves with a dignity and humanity that stood in striking contrast to the systematic dehumanization their family members had endured. They advocated for the complete destruction of the Oxford Apartments building, which was ultimately demolished in November 1992, and for recognition that their sons, brothers, and loved ones were not abstractions in a horror story, but human beings whose lives had value and whose deaths represented an incalculable loss. The building's demolition did not provide closure, and the families have consistently made clear that true closure, the complete accounting for what was taken from them, is something that no verdict, no sentence, and no demolition can ever fully provide. What the case of Jeffrey Dahmer ultimately reveals, beneath all the horror and the clinical fascination that it continues to generate, is a catastrophic human cost of institutional indifference, of inadequate mental health intervention, of systemic bias in law enforcement, and the profound and tragic failure to take seriously the warnings that were present at almost every stage of his escalating violence. 17 young men are dead because of Jeffrey Dahmer, but the systems that were designed to protect them also failed them, and that failure demands a reckoning as serious and as sustained as the one we bring to the crimes themselves. Number 4. Aileen Wuornos, the highway predator whose case forced America to confront the reality of the female serial killer. Aileen Carol Wuornos was born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan, into circumstances so bleak and so thoroughly devoid of the basic scaffolding of human nurturing and protection that her life story reads, from its very earliest pages, as a chronicle of systematic abandonment and abuse that would have broken almost anyone. Her father, Leo Dale Pittman, was a convicted child molester and rapist who was serving time in a Kansas prison at the time of her birth and who would never play any role in her life, eventually hanging himself in his prison cell in 1969 while serving a sentence for the kidnapping and sexual assault of a 7-year-old child. Her mother, Diane Wuornos, was a teenager who had married Leo Pittman at 14 and who found herself so overwhelmed and so ill-equipped for the responsibilities of parenthood that she simply abandoned her children, leaving Aileen and her brother Keith with their maternal grandparents, Lori and Britta Wuornos, in January 1960, when Aileen was just 3 years old and Keith was 4. The abandonment was total and permanent. Diane Wuornos disappeared from her children's lives and did not look back, and Aileen grew up believing that her grandparents were her biological parents, a deception that was maintained until she was approximately 12 years old, and that, when revealed, stripped away yet another layer of the already fragile sense of identity and belonging that she had been struggling to construct. The household of Lori and Britta Wuornos was not a refuge. Lori Wuornos was an alcoholic who subjected the children in his care to regular and severe physical punishment, beating them with a belt for infractions both real and invented, and who the evidence strongly suggests also sexually abused Aileen, though the full extent of what she endured at his hands was something she discussed inconsistently and incompletely throughout her life, in a pattern common among survivors of childhood sexual abuse who have never had access to adequate therapeutic support. Britta Wuornos was a passive and ineffectual presence who did not protect her grandchildren from Lori's violence and who died of liver failure in July 1971. Leaving Aileen and Keith even more exposed to their grandfather's cruelty. The The neighborhood in which they lived offered no sanctuary. By the time she was 11 years old, Aileen had begun exchanging sexual acts with neighborhood boys for cigarettes, drugs, and food, an activity that began not as a choice in any meaningful sense of that word, but as a survival strategy employed by a child who had learned early that her body was the primary currency she possessed in a world that had given her nothing else. By the time she was 14, she was pregnant, the result of a rape by a friend of her grandfather's, and Lori Wernos, rather than providing support or protection, threw her out of the house. She gave birth to a son in a home for unwed mothers in March 1971 and surrendered the baby for adoption, and from that point forward she was effectively homeless, living in the woods near her former home, surviving through prostitution, and navigating an existence of such radical vulnerability and deprivation that it is a testament to something in her fundamental constitution that she survived it at all. She dropped out of school. Keith, her brother and the one consistent human connection of her childhood, was diagnosed with cancer and died in July 1976 at the age of 21, and with his death Aileen lost the last meaningful personal relationship she had. She hitchhiked across the United States, working as a prostitute to survive, accumulating a criminal record that included charges for disorderly conduct, armed robbery, and assault, and moving to the margins of American society with restlessness and a desperation that reflected the utter absence of any stable foundation beneath her feet. In 1976, while hitchhiking in Florida, she met a 69-year-old yacht club president named Louis Gratz-Fell, who fell in love with her and married her within weeks of their meeting. The marriage was a disaster almost immediately. Aileen's behavior, the drinking, the violence, the arrests, made any kind of stable domestic life impossible, and Fell eventually obtained a restraining order against her after she hit him with his own cane. The marriage was annulled after 9 weeks. She drifted back into prostitution and transience, and the years between her marriage to Fell and her arrival in Daytona Beach, Florida, in the mid-1980s were years of accumulating trauma, accumulating criminal record entries, and accumulating evidence of a life being destroyed by forces that had been set in motion long before she had any capacity to resist them. In 1986, Aileen Wernos met Tyria Moore at a gay bar in Daytona Beach, Florida. Moore was a 24-year-old hotel maid, and the relationship that developed between them became the most significant and defining relationship of Aileen's adult life. A relationship characterized by a devotion on Aileen's part that was so intense and so all-consuming that it functioned, for a period, as the closest thing to stability and purpose that she had ever known. Aileen supported them both through her work as a highway prostitute, hitchhiking along Florida's interstate highways and offering sexual services to truckers and motorists who picked her up, and Moore, by her own later account, was aware of how Aileen earned their income, accepted it, and spent it freely on their shared life together. The relationship between Wernos and Moore is central to understanding the context, though emphatically not the justification. For what Wernos did beginning in late 1989, because it was a fear of losing Moore, the terror of abandonment that had haunted every relationship of her life, that she later cited as among the most powerful drivers of decisions she made during the killing period. Whether this explanation was truthful, strategic, or some combination of both has been debated by criminologists, psychologists, and legal scholars ever since, and the question of Aileen Wernos' motivations, which she herself answered differently at different points in her life, remains one of the most contested and complicated in the history of American true crime. The first known victim of Aileen Wernos was Richard Mallory, 51 years old, an electronics repairman from Clearwater, Florida, whose car was found abandoned near Daytona Beach on December 13, 1989. His body was discovered 3 weeks later in a wooded area in Volusia County, shot multiple times with a .22 caliber pistol. The investigation of Mallory's murder proceeded slowly, and it was not until after subsequent murders began to reveal a pattern that his death was fully incorporated into the emerging picture of a serial killer operating along Florida's highways. Wernos later claimed that Mallory had violently and repeatedly raped and sodomized her before she shot him, and this claim, which she maintained consistently for years, gained significant corroboration when investigators later discovered that Mallory had a prior conviction for violent rape in Maryland that had resulted in a 10-year prison sentence, a piece of information that the jury at her trial never heard, because it was not disclosed to the defense in time. The significance of this omission has been the subject of considerable legal and ethical debate, because if Wernos' account of what Mallory did to her was truthful, it fundamentally altered the moral and potentially the legal character of his death, and withholding of evidence that corroborated her account represented a serious failure of prosecutorial fairness. The killings that followed Mallory's death occurred between May and November 1990, and they differed from his in ways that were significant and that Wuornos herself acknowledged. David Spears, 43 years old and a construction worker, was shot 6 times with a .22 caliber pistol, and his body was found in Citrus County in June 1990. Charles Carskaddon, 40 years old, was shot 9 times, and his body was found in Pasco County in June 1990. Peter Seams, 65 years old and a missionary, disappeared in June 1990, and his body was never found, though his car was later recovered after Wuornos, and more were seen abandoning it following a minor accident. Troy Burress, 50 years old and a sausage salesman, was shot twice, and his body was found in Marion County in August 1990. Dick Humphreys, 56 years old and a former Alabama chief of police, was shot 7 times, and his body was found in Marion County in September 1990. Walter Antonio, 60 years old and a truck driver who was also a reserve police officer, was shot 4 times, and his body was found in Dixie County in November 1990. Wuornos claimed, in her various accounts of the killings, that all the men she shot had either raped her or had attempted to do so, and that she had acted in self-defense in every instance. This claim was regarded by investigators and prosecutors as implausible in the cases of multiple victims, and the physical evidence, including the fact that several victims were shot multiple times, including in the back, suggesting they were fleeing rather than attacking, was difficult to reconcile with a straightforward self-defense narrative. The investigation that led to Wuornos' identification and arrest was one of the most technically demanding of its era in Florida law enforcement. The murders were spread across multiple counties and jurisdictions. The victims appear to be unconnected except by the circumstances of their deaths, and the killer left minimal physical evidence at the scenes. What eventually broke the case open was a combination of a composite sketch released by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement based on witness descriptions of the 2 women seen abandoning Peter Seams's car, and a fingerprint recovered from the interior of Seams's vehicle that was eventually matched to Aileen Wuornos through a database search. The composite sketches were published in newspapers across Florida in late 1990, and calls from the public began to identify the 2 women depicted as Aileen Wuornos and Tyria Moore. On January 9, 1991, Aileen Wuornos was arrested at the Last Resort Biker Bar in Port Orange, Florida, where she was a regular. Tyria Moore was located in Pennsylvania, where she had returned to her family following the end of her relationship with Wuornos, and was brought back to Florida by investigators. The strategy employed by law enforcement to obtain Wuornos' confession was one that has been criticized by civil liberties advocates and criminal justice reformers as manipulative and ethically troubling. Moore was offered immunity from prosecution in exchange for her cooperation, and investigators arranged for her to make a series of recorded telephone calls to Wuornos from a motel room while Wuornos was in custody in Volusia County Jail. In these calls, Moore, who was herself deeply frightened and who had been told by investigators that the evidence against Wuornos was overwhelming, wept, expressed her own fear, and repeatedly asked Wuornos to confess to protect her, telling Wuornos that she needed her to do this for her sake. Wuornos, whose love for Moore was the most powerful emotional force in her life, agreed. She gave a full confession to investigators on January 16, 1991. Taking sole responsibility for all the murders and explicitly stating that Moore had no knowledge of and no involvement in any of the killings. Whether this latter claim was entirely truthful was contested by investigators, who believed Moore had known far more than she admitted, but Moore's immunity agreement was honored and she was never charged. The confession that Wuornos gave was detailed, emotionally raw, and characterized by a quality of exhaustive resignation that struck investigators and journalists who observed or reviewed it as the account of someone who had been carrying an enormous and crushing weight and had, in some sense, been waiting for it to be lifted. She described each killing with a directness and an emotional complexity that made simple categorization difficult. She was neither remorseless in the manner of Bundy or Gacy, nor was she the straightforwardly sympathetic victim of circumstance that her supporters wished to present. She was something more complicated and more human than either of those narratives could contain, and the difficulty of placing her within existing frameworks of understanding was something that the legal proceedings, the media coverage, and the cultural debate about her case never fully resolved. Wuornos was tried first for the murder of Richard Mallory in January 1992 in Volusia County. Her defense, led by attorney Tricia Jenkins, argued that she had acted in self-defense after Mallory raped and abused her, and Wuornos herself took the stand to describe in graphic detail the sexual violence she claimed Mallory had inflicted on her. The prosecution, led by Assistant State Attorney John Tanner, argued that the physical evidence was inconsistent with self-defense and that Wuornos had killed Mallory in the course of a robbery. The jury deliberated for approximately 90 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to death. 5 additional trials for the murders of Spears, Carskadden, Humphreys, Burris, and Antonio followed in subsequent months, and in each case Wuornos was convicted and sentenced to death. She was not tried separately for the murder of Peter Seams because his body was never recovered. The years that Wuornos spent on death row at the Broward Correctional Institution in Florida were years of escalating psychological deterioration and of a public and legal battle over her mental competency that raised profound questions about the adequacy of mental health care in the American prison system and about the ethical dimensions of executing someone whose capacity for rational judgment had been severely compromised by decades of trauma and abuse. She fired and rehired her attorneys multiple times, gave contradictory interviews to journalists and documentary filmmakers, and oscillated between claiming that all the killings had been committed in self-defense, claiming that none of them had been, and expressing a desire to be executed as quickly as possible because she did not want to continue living. In 2001, she gave an interview to filmmaker Nick Broomfield for his documentary Aileen, Life and Death of a Serial Killer, in which she appeared visibly disturbed and described being subjected to what she experienced as harassment and persecution by prison officials, making claims about being visited by sound waves and about religious persecution that strongly suggested active psychosis. Her attorneys filed motions arguing that she was not mentally competent to waive her appeals, but the Florida courts ultimately ruled that she was competent to make her own legal decisions, and she continued to pursue her own execution with a determination that many observers found as disturbing as anything else in her case. Her final public act before her execution was to grant an interview to a journalist in which she recanted her self-defense claims entirely, stating that she had killed all of her victims in premeditated acts of robbery and murder, and that she had invented the self-defense narrative to try to avoid the death penalty. Whether this final recantation was truthful, whether it was a product of a mind that had been further destabilized by years of incarceration and inadequate mental health treatment, or whether it represented some form of deliberate performance or provocation, is something that cannot be determined with certainty. What is certain is that it was the last substantial public statement she ever made, and that it was made by a woman who had been failed by every institution that should have protected her from the moment of her birth. On October 9, 2002, Aileen Carol Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at the Florida State Prison in Stark, Florida. She was 46 years old. Her last meal was a cup of coffee, and her last words, delivered in a clear and deliberate voice, were a statement that many observers have interpreted in different ways, but that seemed to express, above all else, the exhaustion of someone who had been fighting a losing battle for her entire life and was finally, in the only way available to her, choosing to stop fighting. The cultural and criminological legacy of Aileen Wuornos is immense and deeply contested. She became the subject of documentaries, books, a major motion picture, Monster, released in 2003, for which actress Charlize Theron won the Academy Award for Best Actress, and an enormous volume of academic and popular analysis that has continued to grow in the years since her death. The debates that her case generated about female violence, about the relationship between victimization and perpetration, about the adequacy of the self-defense doctrine in cases involving sex workers, and about the role of childhood trauma in the production of adult criminal behavior have not been resolved by the passage of time, but have instead become more nuanced and more complex as our understanding of trauma, psychology, and systemic inequality has deepened. The feminist legal scholars and advocates who argued during her lifetime and after her death that the legal system had failed to adequately account for the context of her crimes, the decades of sexual violence, exploitation, and abandonment that preceded them, were not arguing that she should face no consequences for the deaths of 7 men, but rather that a system of justice worthy of the name would have grappled more seriously with the full human reality of her situation rather than processing her with the mechanical efficiency of a system designed for offenders whose lives bore no resemblance to hers. The victims of Aileen Wuornos, 7 men, several of them with families and with people who grieve their loss, also deserve acknowledgement in any full accounting of her case, because their deaths were real and their family suffering was real, and the complexity of Wuornos' own history does not erase or diminish what was taken from them. The truth of this case, as with so many cases that involve the intersection of profound victimization and serious harm to others, resists the kind of simple moral resolution that we instinctively seek, and it is perhaps in that resistance, in the discomfort of holding multiple truths simultaneously, that the most important lessons of Aileen Wuornos' life and death are to be found. Number 5. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, the church president who bound, tortured, and killed for 30 years while living an ordinary life among his neighbors. Dennis Lynn Rader was born on March 9, 1945, in Pittsburgh, Kansas, the oldest of 4 sons born to William Elvin Rader and Dorothea May Cook, a working-class family that relocated to Wichita, Kansas, when Dennis was a young child, and that presented, to all outward appearances, the image of an entirely ordinary Midwestern American household. William Rader worked for Kansas Gas and Electric. Dorothea was a bookkeeper, and the family attended church regularly, participated in community activities, and lived the kind of unremarkable, respectable, quietly aspirational life that characterized millions of American families in the post-war decades. There was no documented history of severe abuse, no obvious dysfunction visible to neighbors or relatives, no dramatic trauma or rupture that would later allow investigators or psychologists to point to a single formative wound around which Dennis Rader's psychology had organized itself in its catastrophically destructive direction. And it is precisely this apparent ordinariness, the absence of the obvious red flags that mark the early histories of so many other killers, that makes the case of Dennis Rader so deeply and persistently unsettling, because it suggests that the darkness he carried was not the product of an environment that failed him in visible and documentable ways, but was instead something that grew in him quietly and privately, nourished by a fantasy life that he cultivated and protected with extraordinary discipline for decades before it finally, inevitably, erupted into violence. From a relatively early age, Rader exhibited behaviors that, in retrospect, were deeply indicative of the psychological trajectory he was following, though at the time they were either not recognized for what they were or were dismissed as the unremarkable eccentricities of a somewhat odd but essentially harmless boy. He was fascinated by bondage from childhood, a fascination that he later described in his courtroom confession with a clinical precision and a complete absence of shame that stunned the observers present, explaining that he had been drawing pictures of bound women and fantasizing about capturing, tying up, and controlling female victims since he was in elementary school. He tortured and killed animals as a child and adolescent, hanging cats and dogs and deriving a sexual gratification from their suffering that he understood, even then, was something he needed to hide from the people around him. He was a voyeur who began peering into neighbors' windows in his teenage years, stealing items of women's underwear from clotheslines and from homes he entered when their occupants were absent, and developing an elaborate fantasy architecture of domination and control that became, over the years, increasingly specific, increasingly detailed, and increasingly violent in its content. He attended Kansas State University, where he studied electronics, served in the United States Air Force from 1966 to 1970, and after his discharge returned to Kansas, where he completed his degree and began working in a series of jobs that placed him, with a dark irony that only became apparent decades later, in positions of authority and surveillance over the communities he lived in. He married Paula Dietz in 1971, and the marriage produced 2 children, a son and a daughter, and lasted for 34 years, a duration that, when it became known following his arrest, generated a wave of shock and incomprehension among those who struggled to reconcile the image of a long-married family man with the reality of what he had been doing in secret throughout that marriage. Paula Rader later stated that she had had no knowledge of her husband's crimes, a claim that investigators found credible, and the portrait of their marriage that emerged from the investigation was one of almost suffocating ordinariness. A conventional suburban household in which the husband mowed the lawn, attended church, coached Boy Scouts, complained about neighborhood code violations, and maintained a surface of such unremarkable domesticity that the idea of what he was concealing beneath, it seemed, to those who knew them, literally impossible. The BTK murders, the name derived from the killer's own description of his method, bind, torture, kill, began on January 15, 1974, when Dennis Rader drove to a house at 803 North Edgemoor Street in Wichita and murdered 4 members of the Otero family in a series of killings of such calculated and methodical cruelty that they remain, nearly 5 decades later, among the most disturbing in the history of American serial murder. Joseph Otero, 38 years old, was a retired Air Force pilot who had recently moved his family to Wichita from Puerto Rico. His wife, Julie Otero, 34 years old, was a homemaker. Their son, Joseph Otero II, known as Joey, was 9 years old. Their daughter, Josie Otero, was 11 years old. On the morning of January 15, 1974, Rader entered the Otero home after cutting the telephone line, confronted the family, and over the course of the following hour bound, gagged, and strangled Joseph, Julie, and Joey with rope and cord he had brought with him, killing them in the living room and bedroom of their own home while other family members were at school. He then took 11-year-old Josie to the basement, where he hanged her from a pipe, and he later confessed in his courtroom statement that he had masturbated over her body after her death, a detail of such breathtaking depravity that the family members present in the courtroom during his confession required considerable composure to remain seated. 3 of the Otero children who were at school when the murders occurred returned home to find their family dead. The investigation that followed was massive, generating thousands of leads and consuming enormous investigative resources, but produced no arrest, and the killer vanished back into the fabric of ordinary Wichita life as though he had never emerged from it. The second BTK murder occurred on April 4, 1974, when Rader broke into the home of Catherine Bright, 21 years old, at 3217 East 13th Street in Wichita, intending to kill her. Her brother Kevin, 19 years old, arrived unexpectedly while Rader was in the house, and Rader shot Kevin twice in the head, leaving him for dead, before attempting to strangle Catherine. Kevin Bright, in an act of extraordinary survival, regained consciousness and escaped from the house, and when Rader was unable to complete the strangulation of Catherine before Kevin's escape threatened to bring police to the scene, he stabbed her multiple times before fleeing. Catherine Bright died of her injuries. Kevin Bright survived, despite having been shot twice in the head at close range, and his survival and his description of the attacker were significant pieces of evidence in the investigation, though they were not sufficient to identify the killer. The first communication from BTK to law enforcement and the media came in October 1974, when a letter was found inside a mechanical engineering textbook in the Wichita Public Library, directed to the Wichita Eagle newspaper and containing a poem about the Otero murders, a description of the crimes that included details known only to the killer and investigators, and the first use of the name BTK. Bind them, torture them, kill them. That would define the case of the next 3 decades. The letter was written in a style that was, at various points, boastful, self-pitying, and grandiose, and it revealed a personality that craved recognition and acknowledgement for its crimes with an intensity that was almost childlike in its naked neediness. Subsequent communications to the media and to law enforcement over the following years reinforced this picture of a killer who was as motivated by the desire for attention and notoriety as by the satisfaction of his violent fantasies, and who experienced the absence of public recognition for his crimes as a genuine grievance. The murders continued. Shirley Vian, 24 years old, was killed in her home on March 17, 1977, after Rader tied her 3 young children in a closet to prevent them from interfering. He had arrived at a different address in the neighborhood, intending to kill a different victim, but when no one answered at his intended target's home, he selected Shirley Vian's house instead, a chilling demonstration of the interchangeability of victims in a psychological framework. They were not people to him, but opportunities, and the specific identity of the person he killed mattered far less than the act of killing itself. Nancy Fox, 25 years old, was murdered on December 8, 1977, after Rader broke into her home, waited for her to return from work, and strangled her with a nylon stocking. He was so pleased with his murder that he called the Wichita police himself the following morning from a pay phone to report where the body could be found, a brazenness that reflected both his contempt for investigators and his need to ensure that his crime received the attention he felt it deserved. He later confessed that after leaving the phone booth, he drove to his own home, ate breakfast with his family, and went to work. Maureen Hedge, 53 years old, and a neighbor who lived on the same block as Rader in the Park City suburb of Wichita, was killed on April 27, 1985. Vicki Wegerle, 28 years old, was killed on September 16, 1986. Dolores Davis, 62 years old, was killed on January 19, 1991. Between the murders, Rader was living a life of surface-level civic engagement and community responsibility that was, in many ways, the perfect cover for what he was, not merely because it made him seem unlikely as a suspect, but because it fulfilled a genuine psychological need in him, the need to be seen as authoritative, competent, and important. He worked for ADT Security Services, installing home security systems, a job whose dark irony, given what he was not lost on investigators or journalists. He later became a compliance officer for Park City, a position that gave him the authority to issue citations to residents who violated local ordinances, and he exercised this authority with zealousness and a pettiness that made him genuinely disliked by many of his neighbors, who complained that he cited people for trivial infractions and seemed to derive personal satisfaction from the power his position gave him over others. He was also president of the Christ Lutheran Church Council, a position he held for years and in which he was regarded by fellow congregants as a dedicated and hard-working church leader. The BTK case went cold in the early 1990s, and by the late 1990s many investigators had begun to suspect that the killer might be dead. Then, in March 2004, a letter was sent to the Wichita Eagle newspaper describing a previously unknown murder. A young woman named Vicki Wegerle, who had been killed in 1986 and whose death had been ruled suspicious but had not been publicly connected to BTK. The letter contained photographs of Vicki Wegerle's body taken at the time of the murder and a photocopy of her driver's license, which only the killer could possess, and was accompanied by a drawing of a bound woman that matched the style of drawings that investigators had come to associate with BTK communications. The killer had returned, and his reemergence triggered a renewed and intensive investigation that consumed the resources of the Wichita Police Department, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, and the FBI. Over the following year, BTK sent additional communications, letters, packages, and eventually a series of floppy disks containing documents and images that were analyzed exhaustively by investigators. The critical breakthrough came when the metadata embedded in one of the floppy disks, a Microsoft Word document, revealed the name Dennis as the last person to modify the document and a church affiliation that was linked, through a simple internet search, to the Christ Lutheran Church in Park City. Investigators cross-referenced this information with a suspect profile they had developed over 3 decades, a white male, middle-aged, likely with military background, organized, local knowledge of Wichita, and probably in a position community authority. And the name Dennis Rader emerged as a compelling candidate. On February 25, 2005, a DNA sample obtained from a pap smear taken from Rader's daughter Carrie at a Kansas State University health clinic was compared with DNA recovered from crime scenes and was found to be consistent with a first-degree relative of the BTK killer. Dennis Rader was placed under surveillance. On February 25, 2005, he was arrested in a traffic stop near his home in Park City, Kansas. He was 60 years old and had been living freely in the community for 31 years, since his first murder. The arrest of Dennis Rader sent a shock wave through Wichita and to the national media that was, in some ways, even more profound than the shock of the original murders, because it confirmed the nightmare scenario that had always lurked at the edges of the BTK investigation, that the killer was not a lurking stranger or a drifting outsider, but a neighbor, a co-worker, a church official, a man who had been among them all along, who had attended their community events and cited their code violations and shaken their hands in the fellowship hall after Sunday services. The courtroom proceedings that followed were among the most extraordinary in the history of American criminal justice. Rader pleaded guilty to all 10 counts of first-degree murder on June 27, 2005, and the hearing at which he entered those pleas became, in effect, a confession session of unusual and deeply disturbing detail. Speaking in the flat, almost bureaucratic tone of someone describing a series of completed work projects rather than the murders of 10 human beings, Rader walked the court through each killing in methodical detail, using terminology he had apparently developed over years of fantasy and planning. He referred to his victims as projects, described the psychological gratification he derived from the killings as the factor and discusses crimes with a self-satisfaction and a pride in his own methodology that was, to the families of his victims seated in the courtroom, an almost unbearable experience. He described how he had conducted reconnaissance on potential victims, how he had prepared hit kits containing rope, tape, and other materials in advance of murders, and how he had fantasized about and planned his crimes for months or years before executing them. He described masturbating at crime scenes and collecting mementos, items of clothing, driver's licenses, jewelry, from his victims, mementos that he kept hidden in a secure location for decades. He described returning to locations where he had disposed of some victims' bodies to engage in what he called sexual fantasies. And he did all of this in the same calm, slightly self-important tone that his neighbors and fellow congregants had always known, the tone of a man who believed himself to be, at some fundamental level, remarkable and special and deserving of recognition, a belief that the murders and now the confession were equally in service of. Because Kansas had no death penalty for crimes committed before 1994, Dennis Rader could not be sentenced to death for any of the 10 BTK murders. He was sentenced on August 18, 2005, to 10 consecutive life terms in prison, with a term structured to ensure that he would serve a minimum of 175 years before becoming eligible for parole, a sentence that was, in practical terms, equivalent to life without the possibility of release. He is currently incarcerated at the El Dorado Correctional Facility in El Dorado, Kansas, where he will remain until his death. The impact of the BTK case on the families of his victims has been documented in years of interviews and advocacy work by survivors and family members who have spoken publicly about what it means to live in the aftermath of crimes that were committed not in a moment of explosive violence, but with the cold and deliberate precision of a planner who selected, studied, and executed his victims with the same methodical care that other people bring to home improvement projects or work assignments. The Otero family, whose 3 children survived the murder of their parents and siblings and grew up in the shadow of that incomprehensible loss, have been among the most vocal and the most dignified of the voices that have kept the human reality of the BTK murders, as opposed to the criminological and media fascination with the killer, at the forefront of public understanding. Kevin Bright, who survived being shot twice in the head by Dennis Rader, lived for decades in Park City, Kansas, the same community where his attacker was also living, coaching Boy Scouts, enforcing code violations, and attending church, without knowing how close he was to the man who had killed his sister and tried to kill him. The revelation that they had been neighbors was, for Bright, one of the most disturbing aspects of an already devastatingly disturbing situation. The forensic and investigative legacy of the BTK case is significant and multifaceted. The case was among the first in the United States in which digital metadata embedded in a document was used as a tool of criminal investigation, a development that has since become a routine and important part of digital forensic practice. The case also demonstrated with powerful clarity the limitations of criminal profiling as practiced in the 1970s and 1980s. Because while the profile developed by the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit was accurate in many of its broad outlines, it was not sufficient to identify the killer from among the population of Wichita residents who fit those broad characteristics. And the case raised, with an urgency that has not diminished with time, the question of what it means for a community to harbor a killer in plain sight for 30 years, what it says about the limits of our ability to know the people we live among, and about the profound inadequacy of a surface presentation of normalcy as evidence of the absence of darkness beneath it. Dennis Rader was not a stranger who came from outside the community to commit his crimes and then disappeared. He was a community, in his church, in his civic roles, in his neighborhood presence. And the horror of what he did is inseparable from the horror of where he did it, not at the margins of ordinary life, but at its very center. Number 6, Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, the man who murdered more women than any other convicted killer in American history, and hid in plain sight for 2 decades. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah, the second of 3 sons born to Thomas Newton Ridgway and Mary Rita Steinman, a family that relocated to the Seattle, Washington area when Gary was still a young child and settled in the working-class suburb of McMicken Heights, near the city of Des Moines, Washington, in the southern end of King County. The household in which Gary Ridgway grew up was defined, above almost everything else, by the outsized and deeply problematic presence of his mother, Mary Ridgway, a woman whom investigators, psychologists, and Gary himself would later describe in terms that painted a portrait of a domineering, controlling, and sexually inappropriate parent whose relationship with her son contained elements that deeply confused and disturbed him in ways that left lasting psychological damage. Mary Ridgway was a large, physically powerful woman who managed a household with iron authority that left her husband Thomas, a quieter, more passive man who worked as a metro bus driver, largely subordinated to her will. She was meticulous about cleanliness and order in the house, obsessively so, and she imposed these standards on her children with a rigidity that left little room for the normal disorder of childhood. But it was the nature of her relationship with Gary specifically, and the manner in which she expressed her dominance over him, that was most psychologically significant. She was physically affectionate with Gary in ways that were described by those who observed the family as inappropriate and boundary-violating, washing him herself long past the age at which such assistance was necessary, touching him in ways that confused the boundaries between maternal care and something more troubling, and simultaneously expressing a controlling anger toward him that oscillated with the physical affection in patterns that left him, according to his own later accounts, perpetually confused about the relationship between love, control, physical contact, and punishment. Gary Ridgway was not an academically gifted child. He struggled significantly in school, eventually being assessed as having a low IQ that placed him in the range associated with borderline intellectual functioning, and the frustration and shame of his academic difficulties compounded the psychological confusion generated by his home environment to create a boy who was increasingly withdrawn, angry beneath the surface, and deeply uncertain about his own identity and his place in the world. He wet the bed until he was approximately 13 years old, a source of profound humiliation in a household presided over by a mother obsessed with cleanliness, and he later recalled that his mother would wash his genitals after bedwetting incidents in a manner that he experienced as simultaneously shaming and confusing. He also recalled, with a disturbing clarity that he maintained throughout his many interviews and confessions, that on multiple occasions during his adolescence he experienced both intense sexual attraction toward his mother and a violent fantasy of killing her, a combination of desire and rage that, psychologists who later studied him suggested, became fused in his developing psychology and eventually transferred onto the category of women who would become his victims. Women who, like his mother, he perceived as simultaneously desirable and deserving of destruction. In his early adolescence, Ridgway committed his first known act of violence when he led a 6-year-old boy into the woods near his home, stabbed him in the side, and then walked away. When the boy began crying, Ridgway reportedly laughed and said he had always wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone. The victim survived, and the incident was apparently not reported to police in any way that resulted in consequences for Ridgway, who returned to the surface of his ordinary life as though nothing had happened. He served in the United States Navy from 1969 to 1971, during which time he was stationed in the Pacific and had his first significant experiences with prostitutes, developing a pattern of using commercial sex workers that would continue throughout his adult life, and that would eventually become the primary mechanism through which he selected and accessed his victims. He married for the first time in 1970, while still in the Navy, to a woman named Claudia Barrows, but the marriage lasted only 2 years. His second marriage, to Marcia Winslow in 1973, lasted until 1981, and it was during this marriage that Ridgway's use of prostitutes became habitual and frequent, a behavior that his wife was unaware of and that Ridgway funded through his employment at the Kenworth Truck Company in Renton, Washington, where he worked painting trucks and where he would remain employed for 32 years, a tenure of such unremarkable duration and reliability that his supervisors and co-workers consistently describe him as a dependable, if somewhat dull and socially awkward, employee. His third marriage, to Judith Lynch in 1988, lasted until his arrest in 2001, and Judith Ridgway later described her husband as an ordinary, even boring man whose only notable characteristic was his strong religious faith. He read the Bible at home, carried it to work, and was known among his acquaintances as an outspoken born-again Christian who was not shy about discussing his faith and who presented, in every aspect of his public and domestic life, the image of a man of conventional, religious conviction and unremarkable personal habits. The Green River killings began in the summer of 1982 and announced themselves to investigators with brutality and a frequency that immediately signaled the presence of a predator of unusual dangerousness and productivity. The name Green River Killer derived from the location where the first cluster of victims was discovered. The Green River, a waterway that flows through the industrial and semi-rural landscape of South King County, Washington, south of Seattle. On August 15, 1982, the body of 16-year-old Wendy Lee Caulfield was found in the Green River near Peck Bridge. On August 12, 1982, 3 days before Caulfield's body was found, though her death had occurred earlier, the bodies of Deborah Lynn Bonner, 23 years old, and Marcia Faye Chapman, 31 years old, were found in the Green River near Frager Road. 2 days later, on August 15th, the body of Cynthia Jean Hines, 17 years old, was also recovered from the river, and on the same day the body of Opal Charmaine Mills, 16 years old, was found on the riverbank. 5 victims discovered within days of one another in the same waterway. The investigation that these discoveries triggered was immediate, intensive, and would ultimately consume more law enforcement resources over a longer period than almost any other case in the history of the Pacific Northwest. The King County Sheriff's Office established a dedicated Green River task force, which at its peak employed more than 50 investigators, and the case attracted the involvement of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, which sent agents including the legendary profiler John Douglas to assist with the investigation. Douglas and his colleagues developed a profile of the likely offender that was accurate in many of its particulars: a white male, probably in his late 20s to mid-30s, likely employed in a blue-collar occupation, probably living or working in the South King County area, likely using a vehicle to transport victims, and probably familiar with the areas where victims were deposited. But the profile was broad enough to encompass a substantial portion of the adult male population of South King County, and the task force's investigation, despite its scale and its dedication, repeatedly failed to focus sufficient attention on the man who was responsible. Gary Ridgway was interviewed by Green River Task Force investigators as early as 1983, when he was identified as a man who had been seen with one of the victims and who was known to frequent the Pacific Highway South Strip, which had become the primary hunting ground from which Ridgway was selecting his victims. He passed a polygraph examination in 1984, a result that deflected investigative attention from him for years, and that became, in retrospect, one of the most consequential failures of the investigation, since Ridgway was a practiced and instinctive liar who apparently had the capacity to pass polygraph examinations even when lying about matters of the most serious consequence. His name continued to appear in the investigation at various points over the following years, but always without sufficient evidence to support an arrest, and the task force's attention repeatedly shifted to other suspects while Ridgway continued killing. The victims of Gary Ridgway shared certain demographic characteristics. Most were young women. Many were sex workers or runaways or young women who were otherwise living on the margins of society in ways that made their disappearances less likely to trigger immediate and sustained investigative attention. And Ridgway himself later acknowledged, with the flat emotional effect that characterized virtually all of his confessions, that he had deliberately selected victims whose vulnerability and social marginality he calculated would reduce the risk that their disappearances would be quickly investigated or connected to one another. He picked up women along the Pacific Highway South Strip, commonly known as the SeaTac Strip, which ran through the cities of SeaTac and Des Moines in South King County, and which was a well-known location for street prostitution. He would negotiate a commercial transaction, drive to a secluded location, and strangle the women with his arm or with ligature during or after the sexual encounter, then dispose of their bodies in clusters in wooded areas, riverbanks, and remote locations scattered across a broad geographic area that extended beyond King County into neighboring counties and even into Oregon. He returned to the disposal sites periodically to engage in acts of necrophilia with the decomposing remains, a behavior that he described in his confessions with a matter-of-factness that investigators found deeply and persistently disturbing even after months of interviewing him. He also, by his own account, returned to some disposal sites to move remains when he believed that investigators were getting close to finding them, demonstrating a practical cunning about evidence management that was all the more remarkable given his low measured intelligence. His method of victim selection, his use of remote disposal sites, his deliberate targeting of women whose social circumstances reduced the investigative urgency of their disappearances, and his ability to maintain a completely ordinary domestic and professional life while committing murders with extraordinary frequency combined to make him one of the most difficult serial killers in American history to identify and apprehend. The breakthrough that eventually led to Ridgway's arrest came not from traditional investigative techniques, but from advances in forensic DNA technology. In 1987, investigators had collected biological evidence from several Green River victims that was consistent with a single contributor, and a saliva sample obtained from Gary Ridgway during the 1987 phase of the investigation had been preserved. When advances in DNA technology in the late 1990s made it possible to generate a DNA profile from the older biological evidence, the profile was compared with the preserved Ridgway sample, and in 2001 the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory confirmed that the DNA recovered from the victims matched Gary Ridgway. On November 30th, 2001, Gary Ridgway was arrested at the Kenworth Truck Company parking lot in Renton, Washington, as he was leaving work. He was 52 years old and had been killing for nearly 20 years. He was initially charged with 4 counts of aggravated first-degree murder based on the victims for whom DNA evidence was available. The investigation and legal proceedings that followed his arrest were shaped from the outset by a fundamental prosecutorial calculation that has remained controversial ever since. The decision by King County Prosecutor Norm Mallon to offer Ridgway a plea agreement that would spare him the death penalty in exchange for his complete cooperation in identifying the full extent of his crimes, providing the locations of undiscovered remains, and assisting investigators in closing outstanding missing persons cases. The agreement, which was reached after lengthy negotiations, was driven by the practical reality that the families of many of Ridgway's victims still did not know where their daughters, sisters, and mothers were buried, and that Ridgway's cooperation was the only realistic means of recovering those remains and providing those families with something approaching resolution. The families of the identified victims were divided in their reaction to the plea agreement, with some expressing profound relief that they would finally learn the truth about what had happened to their loved ones, and some expressing an equally profound outrage that a man who had committed 49 confirmed murders, and who investigators believed had committed many more, would escape the death penalty that so many felt was the only proportionate response to the scale of his crimes. On November 5, 2003, Gary Ridgway pleaded guilty to 49 counts of aggravated first-degree murder in King County Superior Court, making him the most prolific convicted serial killer in American history at the time of his sentencing, a distinction he held until conviction of Samuel Little in subsequent years. The plea hearing at which he entered these guilty pleas and read a statement describing his crimes was one of the most extraordinary and emotionally devastating courtroom proceedings in the history of American criminal justice, both for the sheer scale of what was being acknowledged and for the manner in which Ridgway acknowledged it, in the same flat, affectless, almost administrative tone that had characterized all of his interactions with investigators, a tone that seemed to those present to reflect not suppressed emotion, but a genuine and fundamental absence of it. He described his victims as cargo, as objects to be used and discarded, and he described the act of killing as something that he had done so frequently and with such routine efficiency that it had become, in his own words, like going to work. He was sentenced on December 18, 2003, to life in prison without the possibility of parole on each of the 49 counts. The sentences to run consecutively, which ensured that he would spend the remainder of his life in the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, Washington, with no possibility of release. He is currently incarcerated there and has continued, in the years since his sentencing, to provide investigators with information about additional victims and disposal sites, though the complete accounting of his crimes, the true total number of women he murdered, has never been definitively established. Ridgway himself has given varying estimates of his victim count in different interviews, at various times suggesting that the total number of women he killed was between 75 and 80, though he also acknowledged that his memory of many of the killings was imprecise because of the frequency and the routine nature with which he committed them, a statement that, in its casual revelation of the industrial scale of his killing, was perhaps the single most chilling thing he said in the course of any of his many confessions. The investigation into the Green River killings and its eventual resolution through the Ridgway plea agreement left a complicated and in many ways painful legacy for the families of his victims and for the communities most affected by his crimes. The women he killed many of them young, many of them in circumstances of profound vulnerability, many of them from communities that felt for years that law enforcement did not treat their missing members with the same urgency and the same commitment of resources that would have been brought to bear had they come from more privileged backgrounds, deserved better than the investigation delivered to them during the years when Ridgway was still killing. The criticism that the Green River Task Force, despite its scale and its dedication, was hampered by systemic biases about the relative value of victims' lives, biases that allowed Ridgway to continue killing for far longer than might otherwise have been possible, has been made persistently and consistently by the families of victims, by advocates for sex workers' rights, and by scholars of criminal justice, and it is a criticism that the historical record of the investigation does not entirely refute. The forensic legacy of the Green River case is enormous. The application of DNA technology to biological evidence that had been collected and preserved years earlier was a watershed moment in the use of genetic science in criminal investigation, and the Ridgway case became a model for the retrospective application of advancing forensic technology to cold cases, a practice that has since resulted in the resolution of hundreds of previously unsolvable cases across the United States. The case also contributed significantly to the development of investigative protocols for cases involving vulnerable victims, and to the recognition within law enforcement that the social circumstances of victims should not and must not affect the urgency and the thoroughness with which their cases are investigated. The women who died at the hands of Gary Ridgway were daughters, mothers, sisters, and friends. Many of them were young, teenagers or women in their early 20s, who were in circumstances of vulnerability that they had not chosen and from which they were trying to escape. They were not abstractions or statistics, and the decades of advocacy by their families to ensure that they are remembered as human beings rather than as footnotes in the story of a famous killer represent one of the most important and most enduring elements of the Green River case's legacy. Their names deserve to be spoken, their lives deserve to be remembered, and the failures that allowed Gary Ridgway to take so many of them deserve to be acknowledged with the same seriousness and the same sustained attention that we bring to the crimes themselves. Number 7. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, the satanic predator who turned the city of Los Angeles into a landscape of terror and paralyzed an entire region with fear. Richard Leyva Munoz Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas, the youngest of 5 children born to Julian Ramirez, a former Mexican police officer who had immigrated to the United States and found work as a laborer on the Santa Fe Railroad, and Mercedes Munoz Ramirez, a factory worker who labored in a boot manufacturing plant and who was by all accounts a deeply loving and devoted mother who did everything within her limited means to provide her children with stability and affection in a household defined by the grinding pressures of poverty and by the volatile temperament of her husband, who was a harsh and physically abusive disciplinarian whose rages were feared by the entire family. El Paso in the 1960s was a border city of stark contrasts, the dusty, sun-hammered landscape of far west Texas pressing up against the Rio Grande and the sprawling Mexican city of Ciudad Juarez on the opposite bank. And the neighborhood in which the Ramirez family lived was a working-class community of Mexican-American families navigating the particular challenges of immigrant life in a city and a country that offered opportunity in theory, while frequently withholding it in practice. Richard was, by the account of family members and childhood acquaintances, a quiet and somewhat withdrawn child who suffered from significant health problems in his early years, including epileptic seizures that began when he was very young and that were never adequately treated, and who was marked from early childhood by a combination of physical fragility and a developing inner life that would reveal itself as he grew older to be of extraordinary and terrifying darkness. The most significant early influence on Richard Ramirez's psychological development, the relationship that investigators, psychologists, and Ramirez himself consistently identified as the most formative of his life, was not with either of his parents, but with his older cousin, Miguel Angel Ramirez, a decorated Vietnam War veteran who returned from Southeast Asia profoundly damaged by what he had experienced and witnessed during his service, and who became, for the young Richard, a figure of intense fascination and admiration. Miguel Ramirez had served as a Green Beret in Vietnam and had participated in combat operations of extraordinary violence, and he returned to El Paso with a collection of photographs and a repertoire of stories that he shared freely with his young cousin, photographs and stories that depicted acts of violence, torture, and sexual humiliation inflicted on Vietnamese women that Richard, who was perhaps 5 or 6 years old when he first encountered this material, absorbed with a fascination and a receptivity that in retrospect speaks to something already present in him that was seeking exactly this kind of content to feed on. Miguel showed Richard photographs of Vietnamese women he claimed to have sexually assaulted and murdered, described the experiences in terms that communicated pride and arousal, and in doing so provided his young cousin with a template for the association of sexual gratification with extreme violence against women that would become the foundational architecture of Richard Ramirez's criminal psychology. When Richard was approximately 12 years old, he was present in a motel room when Miguel shot and killed his own wife during an argument, an event that Richard witnessed at close range, and that, rather than traumatizing him in ways that produce fear or revulsion toward violence, appears to have deepened his fascination with it. Miguel Ramirez was found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to a psychiatric facility, and Richard, who had idolized his cousin, was left to process the experience of witnessing a murder at close range without any therapeutic support or adult guidance of any meaningful kind. He began smoking marijuana heavily in his early teens, dropped out of school, and spent his adolescent years drifting between El Paso and various other locations, getting high, stealing, and retreating further and further into a fantasy world whose content was becoming, with each passing year, more violent and more specifically focused on the acts of rape, murder, and domination that Miguel's stories and photographs had introduced him to as a small child. He became a Satanist in his teenage years, drawn to the aesthetics and the ideology of Satanism in ways that reflected both a genuine theological rebellion against the Catholicism of his upbringing and a more straightforward attraction to a belief system that appeared to sanction and celebrate the kind of darkness he had been nurturing within himself. He began to draw pentagrams, to listen obsessively to heavy metal music, particularly the band AC/DC, whose song Night Prowl he later cited as a personal anthem, and to construct an identity around the imagery of evil and transgression that served as both a genuine expression of his inner world and a kind protective mythology that made the violence he fantasized about feel not merely acceptable but cosmically ordained. In the late 1970s, Ramirez drifted to California, eventually settling in the Los Angeles area, where he supported himself through petty theft and burglary and lived in a series of cheap hotels in the Skid Row area of downtown Los Angeles, a transient existence that left almost no social footprint and that allowed him to move through the city with a near-total absence of accountability or oversight. He was arrested several times for minor offenses, car theft, possession of stolen property. But these encounters with the legal system produced no consequences of significance and generated no sustained investigative attention. He was thin, gaunt, and unkempt, with severely decayed teeth resulting from a childhood diet heavy in sugar and an adult life characterized by near total neglect of personal health. And he was by this period consuming cocaine with a frequency and a quantity that was further destabilizing an already deeply unstable psychological architecture. He was also, by the early 1980s, actively rehearsing for the murders he was about to commit, entering homes through unlocked windows and doors, standing over sleeping occupants, and experiencing the power and control of that position in ways that gratified him sufficiently to serve as a temporary substitute for the full enactment of his fantasies, a substitute that was becoming, with each passing month, increasingly inadequate. The Night Stalker killings began in June 1984 and continued until August 1985, a period of 14 months during which Ramirez committed a series of attacks of such random geographical distribution, such varied methodology, and such extraordinary savagery that they generated a level of public terror in the greater Los Angeles area that has rarely been equaled in the history of American crime. The first confirmed victim attributed to Ramirez was Jenny Vincow, 79 years old, who was found murdered in her apartment in the Glassell Park neighborhood of Los Angeles on June 28, 1984. She had been sexually assaulted. Her throat had been slashed with such force that she was nearly decapitated, and her apartment had been ransacked. The savagery of the attack and the absence of any apparent motive beyond the violence itself distinguished it from the typical burglary gone wrong scenario. But at this stage, the killing stood alone and did not immediately generate the recognition that a serial predator was at work. The killings resumed in March 1985 with a frequency and ferocity that quickly made it impossible for investigators to avoid the conclusion that they were dealing with something unprecedented. On March 17, 1985, Ramirez attacked Maria Hernandez and Dale Okazaki at their home in Rosemead, shooting Hernandez in the face at close range as she opened her garage door. She survived because her car keys deflected the bullet, and then entering the house and shooting Okazaki, 20-year-old, in the head, killing her instantly. Within an hour of this attack, he carjacked a vehicle in nearby Monterey Park, abducting and killing the driver, Tsai Yu, 22 years old, by dragging her from the vehicle and shooting her multiple times. 3 attacks in a single evening, spread across multiple jurisdictions, conducted with a randomness and a speed that left investigators struggling to coordinate their responses across the fragmented law enforcement landscape of Los Angeles County. On March 27, 1985, Ramirez entered the home of Vincent and Maxine Zazera in Whittier, shot Vincent Zazera, 64 years old, in the head while he slept, and then subjected his wife Maxine, 44 years old, to a prolonged and sadistic attack that included stabbing, sexual assault, and the gouging out her eyes with a knife, a detail of such extreme and deliberate cruelty that it revealed a dimension of Ramirez's violence that went beyond even the savage opportunism of his other attacks and pointed to a specific and purposeful infliction of degradation that was central to his psychological satisfaction. The eyes were never recovered. The investigation that the Zazera murders intensified was already receiving contributions from multiple jurisdictions across the vast and fragmented geography of the greater Los Angeles area, and the difficulty of coordinating between the Los Angeles Police Department, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, and the law enforcement agencies of the numerous smaller cities and unincorporated communities spread across the region was a significant obstacle to the development of a coherent, investigative picture. The attacks continue with relentless regularity. Harold and Jean Wu, in their 60s, were attacked in their Monterey Park home in March 1985. Bill Doy, 66 years old, was shot in the head in his Monterey Park home in May 1985. His wife Lillian was beaten and sexually assaulted. Mabel Bell, 83 years old, and her sister Florence Lang, 80 years old, were beaten with a hammer in their Monrovia home in May 1985. Bell died of her injuries, and Lang survived with permanent neurological damage. Ruth Wilson, 41 years old, was bound and sexually assaulted in her Burbank home in May 1985, while her 12-year-old son was forced to listen from an adjacent room where Ramirez had tied him. Patty Elaine Higgins had her throat slashed in her Arcadia home in June 1985. Mary Louise Cannon, 75 years old, had her throat slashed in her Arcadia home in July 1985. Whitney Bennett, 16 years old, was beaten with a tire iron in her San Gabriel home in July 1985 and survived only because, according to investigators, Ramirez abandoned the attack when the cord he attempted to strangle her was sparked, which he interpreted as a sign from God, or in his framework, as a divine intervention that he was subsequently moved to describe in terms of satanic significance. Joanne Doy, 16 years old, had her throat slashed in her Monterey Park home in July 1985. Maxon and Lela Needing, 66 and 64 years old respectively, were shot and had their throats slashed in their Glendale home in July 1985. Chanaron Covenant, 32 years old, was shot in the head in his Sun Valley home in July 1985, while his wife Samke was raped and forced to perform additional sexual acts while her 8-year-old son was sodomized by Ramirez in the same room. Elias Abawath, 30 years old, was shot in the head in his Diamond Bar home in August 1985, while his wife was raped and beaten. The geographic expansion of the attacks into the San Francisco Bay Area in August 1985, where Ramirez attacked Peter and Barbara Pan in their Lake Merced home, shooting Peter Pan, 66 years old, in the head and severely wounding Barbara Pan, 62 years old, demonstrated the mobility of the predator and extended the terror beyond the Los Angeles region into a second major metropolitan area, deepening the public panic that the Night Stalker attacks had been generating throughout the summer of 1985. The composite sketch that had been developed from witness descriptions of the attacker, a tall, thin, dark-haired Hispanic man with severely decayed teeth and large dark eyes, had been circulated widely but had not produced an identification, and the investigation, despite the enormous resources being devoted to it, appeared to have stalled. The break in the case came from an unexpected direction. On August 24th, 1985, Ramirez made what was, in retrospect, a characteristically reckless error. He used a stolen Toyota to drive to the Mission Viejo area of Orange County, where he attacked William Carnes, 29 years old, and his fiancée Inez Erickson, 27 years old, shooting Carnes in the head and raping and sodomizing Erickson while demanding that she declare her love for Satan. As he left the scene, a 13-year-old boy named James Romero III, who had been awakened by the sound of the unusual car in his neighborhood, noticed the license plate and wrote it down. The license plate number was traced to the stolen Toyota, which was recovered in a parking garage in the Rampart area of Los Angeles, and fingerprints lifted from the vehicle were run to the California Department of Justice's newly established automated fingerprint identification system, producing a match with a set of prints from a prior arrest, prints belonging to Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez, who had a prior arrest record in Los Angeles for car theft. The identification was made on August 28, 1985, and the decision was made to release Ramirez's name and photograph to the media in an effort to locate him before he could strike again. On the morning of August 31st, 1985, Ramirez arrived at the Greyhound bus terminal in downtown Los Angeles by bus from Tucson, Arizona, where he had briefly traveled after the Mission Viejo attack, and discovered his own photograph on the front pages of newspapers at the terminal's newsstand. He fled on foot into the East Los Angeles neighborhood, and what followed was one of the most extraordinary and chaotic episodes of citizen apprehension in American criminal history. Ramirez attempted to carjack a vehicle on Hubbard Street, was recognized by a resident named Faustino Pinion, who had seen his photograph in the newspaper and who physically fought with him and prevented him from stealing the car, and then fled on foot through the neighborhood, where he was chased by a growing crowd of residents, many of whom had also recognized him from the newspaper photographs. He was cornered, beaten by the crowd, and held until sheriff's deputies arrived to take him into custody. He was 30-year-old, malnourished, and by the accounts of the deputies who arrested him, completely exhausted. The investigation and prosecution of Richard Ramirez was one of the most complex and most expensive in the history of California criminal justice. The case involved multiple jurisdictions, a vast quantity of physical evidence, and the challenge of prosecuting a defendant who had attracted a disturbing following of devoted admirers, mostly young women who wrote him letters, attended his trial, and expressed what appeared to be a genuine romantic fascination with him that the media covered with a breathless attention that many observers found deeply irresponsible. Ramirez's trial began in January 1989 and lasted more than a year, making it at the time the longest murder trial in California history. The prosecution presented evidence across 13 counts of murder and 30 additional felony charges, including rape, sodomy, oral copulation, burglary, and attempted murder, and the evidence was overwhelming in its breadth and its specificity. Fingerprint evidence, shoe print evidence, victim testimony, eyewitness identification, and the testimony of survivors who described their attacker in terms that were both devastatingly specific and emotionally powerful. The defense, hampered by a client who was openly contemptuous of the proceedings and who periodically disrupted the trial with outbursts and gestures, at one point turned to courtroom cameras and displaying a pentagram drawn on his palm, mounted what was, in the circumstances, a largely futile effort to create reasonable doubt. On September 20th, 1989, the jury found Richard Ramirez guilty of 13 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of second-degree murder, 11 counts of sexual assault, and 14 counts of burglary. He was sentenced to death on 19 counts in a sentencing hearing on November 7th, 1989, and was remanded to death row at San Quentin State Prison to await execution. He never expressed remorse for his crimes. In interviews conducted during his years on death row, he spoke about his crimes with pride and a satisfaction that struck interviewers as entirely genuine, and he appeared to regard the notoriety his crimes had brought him as a form of achievement. He continued to receive letters and visits from admirers throughout his incarceration, and in 1996 he married Doreen Leoie, a magazine editor who had been writing to him since his trial, in a ceremony conducted at San Quentin that attracted significant media attention, and that was, for the families of his victims, a source of genuine anguish. The marriage eventually ended when Leoie distanced herself from Ramirez following DNA evidence that confirmed his involvement in one of the murders she had apparently continued to question. Richard Ramirez died on death row at San Quentin State Prison on June 7, 2013, from complications associated with B-cell lymphoma, a form of cancer, while awaiting execution. He was 53 years old and had spent 23 years on death row. His death by natural causes denied the families of his victims the execution that the law had prescribed, and for many of those families the manner of his death, the quiet expiration of a sick man in a prison hospital, rather than the administered justice a lethal injection, was a final and deeply unsatisfying conclusion to a case that had taken so much from so many people. The legacy of the Night Stalker case is, like the cases of so many of the killers examined in this series, one that extends beyond the individual crimes and into the broader landscape of American society and its institutions. The case exposed the fragmentation of law enforcement across the vast metropolitan geography of Los Angeles County, where dozens of independent police agencies with limited communication and coordination protocols were attempting to investigate what was, in reality, a single series of crimes that spanned their jurisdictional boundaries with complete indifference. It contributed to significant reforms in interagency communication and information sharing in California law enforcement, and it was among the early high-profile cases that demonstrated the value of centralized databases for fingerprint and DNA evidence. The victims of Richard Ramirez, 13 confirmed murdered, many more survivors who carried the physical and psychological wounds of their encounters with him for the remainder of their lives, deserve to be remembered not as props in the story of a killer whose notoriety has been amplified by media coverage and by the dark fascination of a subset of the public with the aesthetics of evil, but as human beings whose lives had value, and whose suffering was real, and whose families have carried the weight of what happened to them for decades. The teenager whose eyes were gouged from her body, the elderly women beaten in their beds, the children forced to witness the assault of their parents, the survivors who rebuilt their lives in the shadow of what was done to them. These are the true subjects of the Night Stalker case, and their reality deserves to stand at the center of our understanding of it, undimmed by the dark glamour that has been allowed to accumulate around the man who destroyed them. Number 8. Charles Ng, the sadistic predator who partnered with a fellow monster to create a torture chamber in the California wilderness and committed crimes so depraved that they shocked even the most seasoned investigators in the history of American law enforcement. Charles Cheetading was born on December 24, 1960, in Hong Kong, the son of a wealthy and prominent businessman who provided his family with a life of considerable material privilege in one of Asia's most dynamic and cosmopolitan cities. Unlike virtually every other killer examined in this series, Ng did not emerge from a background of poverty, abuse, or deprivation in any conventional sense. His family was prosperous. His early education was conducted at some of Hong Kong's most prestigious institutions, and the material circumstances of his childhood were, by any objective measure, ones that most children anywhere in the world would have envied. And yet the privilege of his upbringing did not produce in Charles the stability or the empathy or the fundamental respect for other human beings that we might hope material security and educational opportunity would foster. And the question of what did produce the extraordinary capacity for cruelty and the complete absence of moral inhibition that he demonstrated in the crimes he committed as an adult is one that investigators, psychologists, and legal scholars have never been able to answer to their full satisfaction. What is known is that Ng was a deeply troubled child and adolescent despite his privileged circumstances, exhibiting behavioral problems from an early age that resulted in his expulsion from multiple schools in Hong Kong, and that suggested a fundamental difficulty with authority, with the rights of others, and with the kind of empathic regulation that allows most people to navigate the social world without causing serious harm. He was sent by his father to England to continue his education, where he attended the Bentley College Preparatory School in a bid to impose some structure and discipline on his increasingly unmanageable behavior. But the English school environment did not produce the transformation his father hoped for, and he eventually made his way to the United States, where he enrolled briefly at Notre Dame High School in Belmont, California, before enlisting in the United States Marine Corps in 1979 in what appears to have been another attempt to find a structure capable of containing and directing his energy. The Marine Corps experience was brief and catastrophic. Ng was stationed at Kaneohe Bay Marine Corps Air Station in Hawaii, where he was found to have stolen weapons from the base armory, a cache of military equipment valued at approximately $11,000, and he fled before he could be arrested, going absent without leave and making his way to Canada before eventually being apprehended. He was court-martialed, convicted, and sentenced to 3 years in the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, the military's maximum security prison, where he served his sentence before being dishonorably discharged from the Marine Corps. It was during this period, the early 1980s, the years of his military service, and its dishonorable conclusion, that Charles first came into contact with a man who would become his partner in the most elaborate and most sadistic series of murders in the history of California, a man named Leonard Lake. And it is in the nature of that partnership and in the specific and complementary ways in which the two men's pathologies interlocked and amplified each other that the particular horror of the crimes they committed together finds its most disturbing explanation. Leonard Lake was born on October 29, 1945, in San Francisco, California, and was in many respects a dominant and more intellectually sophisticated partner in the relationship he formed with Ng, the architect of the ideology and the physical infrastructure that made their crimes possible, and the primary fantasist whose decades-long elaboration of a specific and detailed vision of sexual slavery and murder provided the blueprint for what they did together in the mountains of Calaveras County. Lake had a troubled childhood marked by the absence of his father and by a domineering mother who sent him to live with his grandparents, and he exhibited from an early age the kind of controlling and manipulative tendencies toward others, particularly toward women and toward younger or more vulnerable individuals, that would define his adult relationships and his criminal activities. He served in the United States Marine Corps during the Vietnam War era, working as a radar operator, and after his discharge pursued a series of relationships and domestic arrangements that were characterized by his attempts to exert total control over his partners. He was married twice, and both marriages were marked by his domineering behavior and by what his wives and former partners later described as a deeply unsettling tendency to treat them as objects to be possessed and controlled rather than as independent human beings with their own desires and autonomy. He was also an amateur filmmaker who produced homemade pornographic videos, a survivalist who was deeply preoccupied with preparations for societal collapse, and a man who had been elaborating in journals and in conversations with trusted acquaintances a detailed fantasy of capturing and enslaving women in a remote location where he could subject them to sexual servitude without interference in the outside world, a fantasy he called Operation Miranda, after character in John Fowles's novel The Collector, the story of a man who kidnaps a young woman and holds her captive in his basement. Lake acquired property in the remote Blue Mountain Road area near the small community of Wilseyville in Calaveras County, a rural county in the Sierra Nevada foothills approximately 150 miles east of San Francisco in the early 1980s, and it was on this property that he began constructing the physical infrastructure of his fantasy, a reinforced concrete bunker hidden behind a workshop on the property, equipped with a bed, restraints, a video camera, and soundproof walls, designed specifically to hold captive women whose captivity would be recorded on video for Lake's gratification. He wrote extensively in his journals about his plans for Operation Miranda, describing in precise and self-congratulatory detail the kind of women he intended to capture, the specific acts he intended to perform with them, and the ultimate disposition of those who ceased to satisfy him or who became, in his cold calculus, liabilities. The journals, which were recovered by investigators following Lake's death and which were read in their entirety by the detectives assigned to the case, were described by those detectives as among the most disturbing documents they had ever encountered in their careers, not because of their graphic content, though the content was indeed graphic, but because of the calm, systematic, almost philosophical manner in which Lake had laid out his plans for the dehumanization and destruction of other human beings, a manner that reflected a mind that had been rehearsing these ideas for so long that they had ceased to feel transgressive and had instead become simply the logical expression of a coherent, if monstrous, worldview. Charles entered this world, the world of Leonard Lake's planning and preparation ideology, through a connection made in the early 1980s, and the relationship between the two men developed quickly into something that was, for both of them, a profound and gratifying meeting of compatible pathologies. Ng was younger, physically capable, and possessed of a willingness to commit acts of direct violence that Lake, who was approaching middle age and whose primary orientation was toward control and domination rather than the immediate physicality of assault, found useful and complementary. Ng admired Lake's intelligence and his elaborate theoretical framework, found in Lake's vision of Operation Miranda a structure that accommodated and validated his own violent fantasies, and brought to their partnership an energy and a recklessness that Lake's more calculating personality could direct and exploit. Together they began to plan, and in 1984 they began to act. The pattern of the crimes committed by Lake and Ng was distinctive and, in the context of the history of American serial murder, unprecedented in its systematic and premeditated character. They did not select victims randomly or opportunistically in the manner of most serial killers, but instead identified specific individuals or families whom they targeted for specific reasons, sometimes because they wanted the victim's property, sometimes because they wanted the victim themselves, and sometimes both. They lured victims to the Wilseyville property through various pretexts, offering to sell them weapons or survival supplies, offering accommodation, or simply inviting them under false pretenses. And once the victims were on the property, Lake and Ng would reveal the true nature of the encounter with a casualness that survivors and witnesses later described as among the most terrifying aspects of the entire experience. They filmed their crimes. The videotapes recovered by investigators from the Wilseyville property, tapes that were reviewed by investigators and by prosecutors, but that were never shown in their entirety in open court, and whose complete contents have never been publicly disclosed, documented the abduction, captivity, sexual enslavement, torture, and murder of multiple victims with a specificity and a duration that made them among the most disturbing pieces of evidence ever presented in an American criminal proceeding. The tape showed Lake and Ng speaking directly to their captive victims, explaining in calm and matter-of-fact terms what was going to happen to them, what was expected of them, and what the consequences of noncompliance would be. They showed the victims, terrified and helpless, being subjected to sexual assaults and humiliations that Lake narrated in the manner of someone conducting a mundane domestic activity. And they documented the transition from captivity to death with a completeness that left investigators with no meaningful uncertainty about what had occurred and who had been responsible for it. The victims of Lake and Ng included Paul Costner, 39 years old, whose car Lake used to drive around the San Francisco Bay Area after his murder, and which was eventually used to identify the killings. Lonnie Bond, 26 years old, his girlfriend Brenda O'Connor, 19 years old, their infant son Lonnie Bond Jr., Scott Stapley, 26 years old, Kathleen Allen, 18 years old, the girlfriend of one of the male victims, who was held in a bunker as a sex slave before being killed, Deborah Dubbs, Harvey Dubbs, their infant son Sean Dubbs, Robin Scott Stapley, Donald Lake, Leonard Lake's own brother, and several additional victims whose identities were established through the painstaking forensic analysis of the remains recovered from the property. The total confirmed victim count reached 11, though investigators and prosecutors believe the actual number was significantly higher. Estimates of the true total have ranged from 11 to as many as 25, with some investigators suggesting that the number could have been even greater given the scale of the operation Lake had been running and the evidence of multiple burial sites on the property. The case broke open on June 2, 1985, in the parking lot of a lumberyard in South San Francisco, when a store employee observed a man, later identified as Charles Ng, shoplifting a bench vise, and alerted Leonard Lake, who was waiting nearby. When a police officer arrived and questioned Lake, he asked for permission to reach into his pocket, withdrew a capsule, and swallowed it before the officer could intervene. The capsule contained cyanide. Lake collapsed within seconds and was rushed to a hospital, where he remained in a coma for 4 days before dying on June 6, 1985. He was 39 years old, and with his death he denied investigators, prosecutors, and the families of his victims the accounting that a trial would have provided, transforming what should have been a comprehensive legal reckoning into a case that was, from the outset, missing one of its two central figures. The identification of the man who had been with Lake at the lumberyard, Charles Ng, who had fled on foot when the police officer arrived and whose identity was not immediately known, was established through the investigation that followed Lake's death, and the search of the Wilseyville property that was conducted in the days and weeks after his arrest produced a full and devastating picture of what had been happening there. Investigators found human bones scattered across the property, some in a trash pit that had been used as an improvised crematorium where bodies had been partially burned and buried. They found the bunker, with its bed and its restraints and its recording equipment, and they found the videotapes that documented the crimes committed within it. They found Lake's journals, meticulously maintained and revealing in their detail. They found personal property belonging to numerous individuals who had no known connection to property, items that included identification documents, clothing, and personal effects that could only have come there in association with their owners. And they found in the cold and methodical inventory of everything that the property contained evidence of crimes whose scope and whose systematic character placed them in a category that was, even in the grim taxonomy of serial murder, almost without precedent. Charles Ng, meanwhile, had fled to Canada, where he was arrested in Calgary on July 6, 1985, after attempting to shoplift food from a store and shooting a security guard in the hand when confronted. His extradition from Canada to the United States became one of the longest and most complex extradition proceedings in the history of North American criminal justice, lasting nearly 6 years and costing the Canadian government an estimated $6 million in legal fees. The delay was driven primarily by Ng's own legal team, which pursued every available avenue of appeal against extradition, including arguments that he could not receive a fair trial in California, and that the death penalty he faced in California constituted cruel and unusual punishment under Canadian law. Arguments that Canadian courts ultimately rejected, but that were pursued with thoroughness and a tenacity that kept Ng in Canadian custody until September 26, 1991, when he was finally extradited to California to face trial. The trial of Charles Ng did not begin until 1998, more than 13 years after crimes were committed, making it one of the most protracted criminal proceedings in California history. The delay between extradition and trial was driven by the extraordinary complexity of the case, the volume of evidence, the number of victims, the involvement of multiple jurisdictions, and the challenge of prosecuting a capital case while ensuring that the defendant received the full protections of due process that the law required. The trial itself, which was conducted in Orange County after a change of venue from Calaveras County, where the crimes were committed, lasted approximately 2 years and generated a trial record of such volume and complexity that it placed enormous demands on everyone involved. Ng represented himself for portions of the trial and used this position to engage in a series of procedural maneuvers and confrontational exchanges with witnesses and a court that were widely interpreted as deliberate attempts to prolong the proceedings and to create ground for appeal. The prosecution's case, presented by Deputy District Attorney Charlene Hoff and her colleagues, was built on the foundation of the videotape evidence, the forensic evidence recovered from the Wilseyville property, testimony from survivors and witnesses who had encountered Lake and Ng in the period leading up to and following the crimes, and expert testimony regarding the identification of the human remains recovered from the property. The videotapes were shown to the jury in controlled conditions, and their impact on proceedings was described by observers as profound and lasting. Jurors who viewed the tapes were described by journalists covering the trial as visibly shaken, and the emotional weight of the recorded evidence appeared to be, for many of them, the single most powerful factor in their deliberations. On February 9, 1999, after deliberating for approximately 5 days, the jury found Charles Ng guilty of 11 counts of first-degree murder, 6 men, 3 women, and 2 infant boys. On June 30, 1999, following a separate penalty phase, the jury recommended the death penalty on all 11 counts. Ng was formally sentenced to death on February 8, 2000 by Orange County Superior Court Judge John Ryan and was transferred to California's death row at San Quentin State Prison, where he remains incarcerated to this day, pursuing an appeals process that has already extended for more than 2 decades, and that, given the pace at which capital cases move through the California appellate system and the state's de facto moratorium on executions, is unlikely to be resolved in the near future. The legacy of the Lake and Ng case is one that exists in a somewhat unusual space within the broader history of American serial murder, in part because the death of Leonard Lake before he could stand trial permanently foreclosed the kind of comprehensive legal reckoning that the case demanded, and in part because the extraordinary length of the proceedings against Ng, from his arrest in 1985 to his sentencing in 2000, a period of 15 years, meant that the public attention that might have sustained engagement with the case had largely dissipated long before its conclusion. But the case's significance within the history of American criminal justice is undeniable and enduring. It was among the first cases in the United States in which videotaped evidence of the commission of murders was presented at trial, raising profound questions about the use of such evidence and about the psychological impact of its exposure on jurors that have been debated by legal scholars ever since. It exposed significant gaps in the extradition framework between the United States and Canada that were subsequently addressed through diplomatic negotiations. And it demonstrated, with a clarity that demanded acknowledgement, the specific and extraordinary danger represented by the combination of two complementary pathologies in a partnership that enabled both individuals to commit crimes that neither might have been capable of committing alone, a dynamic that the case of Lake and illustrated more completely and more disturbingly than perhaps any other case in the history of American crime. The victims, among them an infant who was less than a year old, teenagers who were barely beginning their adult lives, and young couples whose only mistake was to trust the men who offered them something they needed, deserve to be at the center of any reckoning with this case. And the families who have carried the weight of their loss through decades of legal proceedings that have produced resolution without anything resembling justice deserve acknowledgement for the dignity and the perseverance with which they have conducted themselves in the face of crimes that tested the limits of human endurance. Number 9, David Parker Ray, the toy box killer, the man who built a chamber of methodical horror in the New Mexico desert and subjected his victims to acts of torture so systematic and so elaborate that investigators who entered his purpose-built dungeon described the experience as the most disturbing of their entire careers. David Parker Ray was born on November 6, 1939, in Belen, New Mexico, a small town situated along the Rio Grande in the central part of the state, into circumstances that were, from the very earliest pages of his life, defined by abandonment, instability, and the particular cruelty of childhood spent in an environment that offered neither the security of consistent parental love nor the protection of any adult figure capable of providing genuine care and guidance. His father, Cecil Ray, was an alcoholic whose drinking made him violent and unpredictable, and whose relationship with his children was characterized by the kind of erratic and explosive cruelty that leaves psychological wounds of depth and a persistence that conventional therapeutic intervention rarely fully addresses. His mother, who found the demands of raising children in the context of Cecil Ray's alcoholism and violence beyond what she was able or willing to manage, abandoned the family when David was very young, leaving him and his sister to be raised by their paternal grandparents in the small rural community of Mountain Air, New Mexico, where David spent most of his childhood in conditions of material poverty and emotional deprivation that were relieved at various points by visits from his father that were, according to David's own later accounts, sources of both desperate longing and predictable disappointment. The grandparents who raised David were not cruel in the deliberate and purposeful manner of his father, but they were old, limited in their capacity to engage the emotional needs of a traumatized child, and fundamentally unable to provide the kind of warm, responsive, and attuned parenting that might have offered some counterweight to the damage already done by abandonment and paternal violence. David grew up quiet, withdrawn, and deeply isolated, a child who had learned very early that the adults in his life were not reliable sources of comfort or protection, and who had responded to this knowledge by retreating into an internal world that he maintained with increasing care and increasing secrecy as he grew older. He was subjected to bullying by peers throughout his school years, a consequence both of his poverty and of the social awkwardness that his isolation had produced, and the cumulative experience of being both failed by the adults who were supposed to protect him and tormented by the peers among whom he was supposed to find belonging created in him a reservoir of rage and humiliation that he would spend the rest of his life seeking to discharge. His father, Cecil, visited periodically, and on at least some of these visits, brought with him collections of sadomasochistic pornography that he shared with his son, an act of profound parental failure and boundary violation that exposed David, at an age when his sexuality was still forming and his psychological defenses were still rudimentary, to material that associated sexual gratification with the infliction of pain and humiliation, and that provided him with a template for his sexuality of domination and cruelty that would shape his fantasies and eventually his crimes for the remainder of his life. By his early teenage years, David Parker Ray was already drawing detailed pictures of women in bondage and experiencing sexual fantasies of capture and torture that he kept carefully hidden from everyone around him, recognizing instinctively that the content of his inner life was something that the world outside would not understand or tolerate. He was, by all accounts, a mechanically gifted young man, intelligent with tools and machinery in a practical, hands-on way that found no outlet in academic achievement, but expressed itself in a facility with construction and fabrication that he maintained throughout his adult life, and that would eventually be applied to the most horrifying of purposes. He served in the United States Army after completing high school, receiving training as a mechanic, and after his discharge, he worked in a series of blue-collar jobs in New Mexico, including as a mechanic for the New Mexico State Parks Department, a position he will hold for many years, and that will provide him with both a steady income and, crucially, access to state property in remote locations that he would later use in connection with his crimes. He married and divorced multiple times, fathering a daughter named Glenda Jean Ray, known as Jessie, whose eventual involvement in her father's crimes would add a dimension of familial complicity to the case that made it still more disturbing to the investigators and prosecutors who handled it. He settled eventually in the small community of Elephant Butte, New Mexico, a remote desert town situated on the banks of Elephant Butte Lake, the largest reservoir in New Mexico, where he lived in a trailer and gradually, over a period of years, constructed on his property the elaborate and purpose-built torture facility that became known, after its discovery by law enforcement in 1999, as the Toy Box. The Toy Box, the name derived from Ray's own description of it, a name that combined the language of childlike playfulness with the reality of a space designed for the most extreme forms of adult cruelty in a juxtaposition that investigators found particularly chilling, was a custom-built trailer approximately 22 feet long and 15 feet wide that Ray had constructed and outfitted with a comprehensiveness and a specificity of purpose that testified to decades of planning, preparation, and the gradual accumulation of both the physical materials and the psychological certainty required to bring his fantasy to its full realization. The interior of the Toy Box, as investigators discovered when they first entered it in March 1999, was equipped with a gynecological examination table fitted with restraints at the wrists, ankles, and neck, a system of pulleys and winches mounted on the ceiling and walls that could be used to suspend victims in various positions, a large collection of surgical and medical implements arranged on shelves and in cabinets, a specialized dildo chair designed to subject restrained victims to forced penetration, a collection of whips, clamps, electrodes, and other instruments specifically designed for the infliction of pain, a large mirror mounted on the ceiling above the examination table, so that victims would be forced to watch what was being done to them, a homemade electrical device that Ray had constructed himself, and that was designed to deliver controlled electrical shocks to sensitive areas of the body, a video camera and recording equipment, an audio system connected to speakers, and a medical-grade intravenous setup that Ray used to administer drugs to his victims. The walls of the Toy Box were decorated with drawings and diagrams that Ray had created himself, depicting women in various positions of restraint and subjugation, diagrams that functioned both as instructions for practices he intended to perform and as a kind of decorative expression of the worldview he constructed around his crimes, a worldview in which the capture, restraint, and systematic torture of women was not a crime but a practice, a discipline, an art form to which he had devoted decades of preparation and refinement. The estimated cost of the equipment and construction of the Toy Box was later assessed at approximately $100,000, a figure that reflected not only the financial investment Ray had made in his crimes, but the extraordinary duration of the planning that had preceded them, decades during which he had been saving, acquiring, constructing, and perfecting the infrastructure of a torture chamber, while maintaining, to everyone around him, the appearance of an ordinary, if somewhat eccentric, working man living quietly in the New Mexico desert. Ray did not act alone. He recruited a series of associates and accomplices over the years who participated in his crimes to varying degrees, and the most significant of these accomplices were his girlfriend, Cindy Hendy, a woman who moved in with Ray in the late 1990s and who became an active and enthusiastic participant in the abduction and torture of victims, and his daughter Jessie Ray, whose involvement in luring at least one victim to her father's property represented a degree of familial complicity in serial torture and attempted murder that the investigators and prosecutors involved in the case found almost impossible to fully process. The manner in which Ray and his accomplices operated was distinctive and, in its specificity, deeply premeditated. Ray would identify potential victims, typically women who were socially vulnerable, often struggling with drug addiction or financial desperation, and often known to Ray through the social networks of Elephant Butte and the surrounding communities, and lure them to his property through promises of drugs, money, or simply the offer of companionship. Once a victim was on the property, she would be drugged with a combination of substances that Ray administered through drinks or through intravenous injection, rendering her unconscious, and when she regained consciousness, she would find herself restrained on the examination table in the toy box, with a tape recording playing through the speakers that Ray had prepared specifically for this purpose. The tape recording, which was recovered by investigators and played in its entirety during Ray's trial, was one of the most chilling pieces of evidence in the case, not because of its graphic content, though the content was indeed graphic, but because of the manner in which it was delivered. In the calm, measured, almost paternal voice of a man explaining to a frightened and disoriented woman, with the patience and the thoroughness of someone who had given this explanation many times before, precisely what her situation was, what was going to be done to her, how long it was likely to last, and what the consequences of noncompliance would be. The tape told the victim that she had been kidnapped, that she was now the property of the man who had taken her, that she would be used as a sex slave for an indeterminate period, that attempts to escape or to resist would result in escalated punishment, and that when her captivity was concluded, she would be either released, with her memory chemically erased through the administration of drugs, including Rohypnol and other amnesiac agents, or killed, depending on factors that the tape did not specify. The tape addressed the victim as bitch throughout, a deliberate and sustained dehumanization that Ray apparently believed was both practically useful, in that it discouraged a kind of emotional response in the victim that he found inconvenient, and ideologically consistent with his view of women as objects without autonomous standing. Ray used a drug called scopolamine, in combination with other substances, to induce amnesia in victims he intended to release, and investigators believe that a significant number of women were subjected to torture in the toy box, and then released with their memories chemically suppressed, explaining why there were so few reports to law enforcement, and why the full extent of Ray's crimes was not discovered until 1999. The estimated number of victims has been assessed by investigators as potentially as high as 60 over a period that may have extended from the 1950s through the late 1990s, a span of nearly 5 decades during which Ray refined and expanded his methods, while the absence of victim reports and the remoteness of his location allowed him to continue with virtual impunity. The case came to law enforcement's attention in March 1999 through the escape of a victim named Cynthia Vigil, 22 years old, who had been held captive in the toy box for 3 days when she managed, in a moment of extraordinary courage and resourcefulness, to free one of her hands from her restraints, retrieve a key that Cindy Hendy had left within her reach, unlock the collar that was attached to a chain securing her to the examination table, and escape from the toy box wearing only a dog collar and a padlock chain, running to a neighbor's trailer and calling the police. Her escape triggered an immediate police response, and when investigators arrived at David Parker Ray's property and entered the toy box, what they found transformed what had begun as a report of a kidnapping into one of the most significant and most disturbing criminal investigations in the history of New Mexico law enforcement. The search of the property over the following days revealed not only the toy box and its contents, but additional evidence of the scope and the duration of Ray's crimes. Journals in which he described his activities in clinical detail, videotapes that documented the torture of multiple victims, and physical evidence that suggested the involvement of multiple accomplices and a victim count far exceeding the single kidnapping that had triggered the investigation. A second victim, Kelly Garrett, was identified shortly after Vigil's escape, and a third victim, Angelica Montano, had reported being kidnapped and tortured to police in 1996, a report that had not been adequately investigated and that, had it been properly followed up, might have resulted in Ray's arrest 3 years before Cynthia Vigil's escape. Jessie Ray, Ray's daughter, was arrested and charged with kidnapping in connection with her role in luring Cynthia Vigil to her father's property and her participation in Vigil's captivity. She pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. Cindy Hendy, Ray's girlfriend, was arrested and charged with kidnapping and conspiracy and eventually cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence, pleading guilty and receiving a 36-year sentence. A third associate, Roy Yancey, pleaded guilty to the murder of a victim named Marie Parker and was sentenced to 9 years in prison. David Parker Ray himself was charged with kidnapping, torture, and a range of associated offenses in a series of trials that were complicated by Ray's deteriorating health. He had suffered a heart attack in 2000 that left him with significant cardiac impairment, and by the challenges of prosecuting a case involving victims whose memories had been chemically suppressed and who were therefore unable to provide the kind of detailed eyewitness testimony that would normally form the backbone of a prosecution Ray's first trial in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, in 2000 ended in a conviction for which he was sentenced to 224 years in prison. Additional trials were proceeding when Ray died of a heart attack on May 28, 2002, at the Lea County Correctional Facility in Hobbs, New Mexico. He was 62 years old, and his death, like that of Leonard Lake before him, closed the legal proceedings against him before the full accounting that his crimes demanded could be completed. He was never charged with murder, because despite the extraordinary evidence of torture and captivity recovered from his property, and despite the testimony of investigators who were confident that he had killed multiple victims, the bodies of murder victims were never definitively identified and linked to him in sufficient numbers and with sufficient evidence to support murder charges. The absence of murder convictions, the fact that a man whom investigators believed had killed as many as 60 people died, having been convicted only of kidnapping and torture, represents one of the most profound frustrations in the history of American criminal justice, and it is a frustration that the families of those who may have been among his victims are left to carry permanently without the resolution that a murder conviction and an acknowledgement of their loved one's fate would have provided. The legacy of the David Parker Ray case is one that raises disturbing questions about the vulnerability of isolated communities to predators who use their local knowledge, their social networks, and the limited institutional resources available in remote areas to operate for extended periods without detection. It raises questions about the adequacy of the investigative response to the 1996 report by Angelica Montano, whose account of kidnapping and torture, if properly investigated, might have ended Ray's crimes years before Cynthia Vigil's escape. And it raises, with an urgency that has not diminished with time, questions about the degree to which the social vulnerability of the women Ray targeted, women struggling with addiction, poverty, and a particular precariousness of life in a small and economically depressed desert community, contributed to the absence of the kind of systematic investigative attention that might have identified the threat he represented far earlier than it was ultimately recognized. Cynthia Vigil, whose courage in escaping from the toy box ended David Parker Ray's active criminal career, has spoken publicly about her experience and its aftermath in terms that reflect both the profound and lasting damage that her captivity inflicted and the remarkable resilience that she has demonstrated in rebuilding her life in its wake. Her escape was an act of bravery that, in the most direct and literal sense, saved not only her own life, but potentially the lives of the unknown number of women who would become Ray's future victims had she not found the strength and the clarity to free herself, run barefoot through the desert to a neighbor's door, and bring the full weight of law enforcement down on the man who had built his chamber of horrors in the shadow of the New Mexico mountains and operated it for decades without consequence. Number 10, Edmund Kemper, the co-ed killer, the towering genius of murder who killed his grandparents at 15, was released back into society, and then embarked on a killing spree that culminated in the murder of his own mother before he calmly called the police and turned himself in. Edmund Emil Kemper III was born on December 18, 1948, in Burbank, California, the second of 3 children born to Edmund Emil Kemper II and Clarnell Stage, a couple whose marriage was, by virtually every account left by those who knew them and by Kemper himself in extraordinary depth and detail of the interviews he later gave to FBI agents and investigators, a union of profound and mutually reinforcing dysfunction that expressed itself most damagingly in the life of the child who had won. They become one of the most studied and most articulate criminal subjects in the history of American forensic psychology. Edmund Kemper II was a World War II veteran who had participated in nuclear weapons testing in the Pacific and who worked, after the war, as an electrical testing engineer, a man whom his son would later describe with a mixture of admiration and bitterness as physically powerful, conventionally masculine, and largely absent, a father whose presence in the household was limited enough that his absence became, for young Edmund, both a source of profound longing and a template for a kind of masculine authority that he simultaneously idealized and resented. Clarnell Stage Kemper was, by the accounts of virtually everyone who knew her and by her son's own extensive and detailed recollections, a deeply difficult and psychologically damaging woman whose treatment of her son Edmund was characterized by a combination of contempt, hostility, and humiliation that was so consistent and so pervasive that it constituted, whatever its precise psychological classification, a form of sustained emotional abuse that left wounds of extraordinary depth and persistence. She was a large, physically imposing woman with a domineering personality and a sharp, cutting tongue, and she directed toward her son Edmund a specific and focused hostility that was qualitatively different from the manner in which she related to her other children, a hostility that appeared to be driven, at least in part, by a conviction that he was destined to become violent and dangerous, a conviction that she acted upon in ways that may, with devastating irony, have contributed to the very outcome she feared. She made Edmund sleep in a locked basement bedroom, explaining to her other children that she did this because she was afraid of him, a statement that communicated to Edmund, with unmistakable clarity, that he was regarded by his own mother as a monster before he had done anything to deserve that designation, and that the love and acceptance that every child requires as a fundamental condition of healthy development were not available to him in his own home. She ridiculed him relentlessly, telling him that he was ugly, that no woman would ever love him, that he was stupid and worthless, and delivering these assessments with consistency and a conviction that, in the absence of any counteracting source of affirmation or belonging, gradually and devastatingly became the lens through which Edmund Kemper understood himself and his place in the world. Clarnell and Edmund, too, divorced when Edmund was 7 years old, and Clarnell moved with the children to Montana, then to California, and eventually settled in Santa Cruz, California, in a series of relocations that further disrupted whatever social connections Edmund had been able to form, and that deepened his already profound isolation. Edmund, too, for his part, remarried and receded from his son's life to such a degree that Edmund later recalled, with a matter-of-factness that was itself revealing, that he had essentially grown up without a father. The childhood of Edmund Kemper was, in the retrospective light of what he became, a chronicle of developing pathology that was documented in his own words with remarkable and unsettling precision. He was fascinated with death from a very early age, decapitating his sister's dolls, burying the family cat alive, and later digging up its body and mounting its head on a stick, behaviors that he described in later interviews not with shame or embarrassment, but with an almost anthropological curiosity about the child he had been and the trajectory those behaviors represented. He played games with his sister that involved fantasizing about death and execution, asking her to tie him to a chair and pretend to electrocute him, and he experienced sexual feelings in association with these games that confused and disturbed him even at the time. He was large for his age. He would eventually reach 6 feet 9 inches in height and weigh approximately 290 pounds, a physical enormity that set him further apart from his peers, and that contributed both to his isolation and to a particular quality of physical intimidation that he would later deploy in his crimes. He was also, as measured by multiple intelligence assessments throughout his childhood and adolescence, exceptionally intelligent, with an IQ that has been reported at various points as between 136 and 145, placing him in a range associated with superior to very superior intelligence, a cognitive capacity that would later express itself in the extraordinary articulateness and self-awareness of his interviews with FBI agents, and that made him, paradoxically, one of the most valuable criminal subjects ever studied, a man whose ability to describe his own psychological processes in precise and nuanced language provided investigators and psychologists with insights into mechanics of criminal psychology that they could not have obtained from less articulate or less self-reflective subjects. When Kemper was 9 years old, his mother sent him to live with his father, who had remarried and who was not prepared for the arrival of a disturbed and emotionally damaged child in his new household. Edmund, too, sent his son back to Clarnell after a period that was unhappy for everyone involved, and Clarnell, unwilling to deal with him herself, sent him at the age of 14 to live with his paternal grandparents, Edmund and Maud Kemper, on their remote ranch in North Fork, California, in the Sierra Nevada foothills. His grandfather, Edmund Kemper Sr., was a writer of children's stories, and his grandmother, Maud, was a domineering and controlling woman who reminded young Edmund, with an uncomfortableness that he later described explicitly, of his mother. The months that Edmund spent on his grandparents' ranch were months of deepening isolation and escalating internal pressure, a period during which the fantasies of violence and control that had been developing in him since childhood were becoming increasingly specific, increasingly urgent, and increasingly focused on the people immediately around him. He was, by his own later account, experiencing fantasies of killing his grandmother that were becoming impossible to suppress, fantasies that were driven partly by his resentment of her controlling manner and partly by a more generalized rage that had been accumulating for years and that had found, in the isolation of the ranch, no outlet and no relief. On August 27, 1963, Edmund Kemper, 15 years old, shot his grandmother Maud in the head with a .22 caliber rifle while she was sitting at the kitchen table working on a crossword puzzle. When she fell from her chair, he stabbed her multiple times in the back. He then waited for his grandfather to return home, shot him in the head in the driveway before he could enter the house, and then called his mother to tell her what he had done. When investigators later asked him why he had killed his grandmother, Kemper offered an answer that has become one of the most quoted and most analyzed statements in the literature of criminal psychology. He said he killed her to see what it felt like, and that he shot his grandfather because he did not want him to come home and find his wife dead. He was 15 years old. Kemper was arrested, evaluated by psychiatrists, and found to be a paranoid schizophrenic, though this diagnosis was later contested and revised by subsequent evaluators who found the evidence for a psychotic disorder unconvincing and who characterized him instead as a severe antisocial personality with sexual sadism, a characterization that, in the retrospective light of his later crimes, seems considerably more accurate. He was committed to the Atascadero State Hospital, a maximum security facility for the criminally insane in California, where he would spend the next 5 years. The years at Atascadero were, paradoxically, among the most formative and in many ways the most consequential of Kemper's life, and not primarily because of the treatment he received there, though he did receive treatment, and did demonstrate what appeared to be significant improvement, but because of what he learned from the institution and from the people within it. He was highly intelligent, highly motivated to present himself favorably, and highly attentive to the expectations and the evaluative frameworks of the psychiatric staff around him. And he learned, with extraordinary efficiency and precision, how to present himself in the manner most likely to result in favorable assessments, reduce restrictions, and eventually release. He worked in the hospital psychological testing program, administering tests to other patients and scoring the results, which gave him an intimate familiarity with the instruments used to evaluate psychiatric patients and a detailed understanding of what the clinicians administering those instruments were looking for and how responses were interpreted. He used his knowledge, deliberately and systematically, to shape his own responses and subsequent evaluations in ways that he calculated would produce the most favorable possible clinical picture, and the staff at Atascadero, who found him cooperative, articulate, and apparently genuinely improved, recommended his release. In 1969, over the strong objections of the California Youth Authority, Edmund Kemper was released from Atascadero at the age of 21 and, in a decision of almost incomprehensible institutional failure, was remanded to the custody of his mother, Clarnell Stage, who was by this time working as an administrative assistant at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and living in Aptos, California. The California Youth Authority had explicitly recommended that Kemper not be returned to his mother's custody, citing the toxic nature of their relationship and the risk that its resumption would be psychologically destabilizing. But this recommendation was disregarded. The adult records of Kemper's juvenile crimes were sealed, as was standard procedure under California law, meaning that when Kemper applied for a firearms identification card and purchased a series of weapons in the early 1970s, the background check revealed nothing that would have prevented the sale. He moved in with his mother, and the relationship between them resumed almost immediately the pattern of mutual hostility, recrimination, and humiliation that had characterized his childhood, with Clarnell continuing to belittle and demean her son, and Kemper absorbing her contempt with an outward patience that concealed an interior pressure that was, by this point, approaching its critical threshold. He worked various jobs, attempted to join the California Highway Patrol, but was rejected because of his height, and spent considerable time socializing with officers of the Santa Cruz Police Department, with whom he became genuinely friendly and who knew him by his nickname, Big Ed. He drank with them at a local bar called the Jury Room, listened to their stories about cases they were working, and cultivated a relationship with law enforcement that would later prove useful to him in ways that the officers involved would find deeply disturbing when they understood its full implications. The Santa Cruz area in the early 1970s was already a hunting ground for a different serial killer, Herbert Mullen, who was killing victims in the mountains around Santa Cruz, during roughly the same period, and the coincidence of two active serial killers operating simultaneously in the same relatively small geographic area is a statistical anomaly so extraordinary that it has been the subject of considerable criminological analysis, though no explanation more satisfying than the random workings of terrible chance has ever been advanced. Kemper began his series of murders in May 1972 when he picked up two hitchhiking college students, Marion Pesci and Anita Lucchese, both 18 years old, who were students at Fresno State College and who were hitchhiking to Stanford University. He drove them to a remote area, stabbed and strangled both of them, transported their bodies to his apartment, and performed acts of necrophilia and dismemberment before disposing of the remains in various locations in the mountains around Santa Cruz. He then drove past the Santa Cruz Police Department, where he was a familiar and friendly presence, with the victims' heads in a bag in the trunk of his car. The victims he selected over the following months shared certain characteristics. They were all young women, most of them college students, hitchhiking in the Santa Cruz area, a practice that was extremely common in the early 1970s, and that was regarded at the time as an essentially safe and socially accepted mode of transportation for young people in the countercultural communities of coastal California. Kemper exploited this cultural practice with a deliberateness and a specific targeting that, combined with his large and initially reassuring physical presence and his easy social manner, made him extraordinarily effective at gaining victims' trust before revealing the reality of their situation. Aiko Koo, 15 years old, was killed in September 1972 after Kemper picked her up while she was hitchhiking to a dance class. Cindy Shaw, 19 years old, was killed in January 1973 after being picked up while hitchhiking. Rosalind Thorpe and Alice Liu, both in their 20s and both students at the University of California, Santa Cruz, were killed in February 1973 after being picked up on the UC Santa Cruz campus. The proximity of his victims to his mother's workplace, the University of California, Santa Cruz, was not coincidental, and Kemper himself later acknowledged that the selection of victims connected to the institution where his mother worked was an expression of the rage toward her that was the central psychological engine of his crimes. Throughout this period, Kemper continued his social relationship with the Santa Cruz police officers, drinking with them, discussing their investigations, which included, though they did not know it, the murders he himself was committing, and presenting to them, as he had presented to the staff at Atascadero, the image of a large, affable, somewhat unusual but fundamentally harmless man whose interest in criminal matters was the curiosity of a frustrated, would-be law enforcement professional, rather than the operational intelligence gathering of an active serial killer. The officers later recalled, with a particular anguish of people reviewing a series of missed opportunities in retrospect, that Kemper had on several occasions discussed the co-ed murders case with them in terms that, had they known what they knew afterward, contained details that only the killer could have possessed, details that he offered with the calm confidence of a man who was entirely certain that no one in the room recognized their significance. The final and most extraordinary chapter of Edmund Kemper's killing spree began in the early morning hours of Easter weekend, April 20th, 1973, when he entered his mother's bedroom while she slept and beat her to death with a hammer, then cut off her head, used it as a target for darts, placed it on a shelf, and screamed at it for sustained verbal abuse of his entire life. He then called his mother's best friend, Sarah Hallett, invited her over for a surprise Easter dinner, and when she arrived, strangled her, decapitated her, and placed her body in a closet. He then got into his car and drove east, listening to the radio as he went, waiting to hear news reports of the discovery of his mother's body that would announce to the world what he had done. When no such reports came, Kemper drove for several days across multiple states before stopping at a payphone in Pueblo, Colorado, and calling the Santa Cruz Police Department, the officers with whom he had been drinking at the jury room throughout his killing spree, to confess. The officer who took the call initially did not believe him. Kemper called multiple times and was eventually taken seriously, at which point he remained at the payphone, waiting calmly for local Colorado police to arrive and take him into custody. He was 34 years old at the time of his arrest, and the manner of his surrender, the voluntary call, the patient waiting, the almost relieved quality of his confession, suggested to the investigators who subsequently interviewed him that the murders had, in some fundamental sense, accomplished what he had been trying to accomplish all along, that the killing of his mother had discharged the specific and consuming rage that had been the psychological foundation of his crimes, and that, with her death, he had no further need or desire to continue. The trial of Edmund Kemper began in October 1973 in Santa Cruz, California, and Kemper, despite his evident intelligence and his detailed understanding of the legal proceedings, entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, the same defense that had been available to him at 15 and that had secured his placement at Atascadero rather than a conventional prison sentence. The prosecution presented a case built on Kemper's own confessions, which were remarkable both for their detail and for the psychological insight they contained, and on the physical and forensic evidence recovered from the crime scenes and from Kemper's vehicle and apartment. The defense presented psychiatric testimony supporting the insanity claim, but the prosecution countered effectively with its own experts, and the jury, after deliberating for approximately 5 hours, returned a verdict of guilty on 8 counts of first-degree murder. Kemper was sentenced to life in prison. The death penalty was not available in California at the time because the state Supreme Court had temporarily struck down the death penalty statute, and he expressed, at his sentencing hearing, a preference for his own execution over life imprisonment, reportedly requesting that he be tortured to death. This request was, of course, not granted. Edmund Kemper has been incarcerated at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville, California, since his sentencing, and he has remained there for more than 5 decades, becoming in that time one of the most extensively interviewed and most carefully studied criminal subjects in the history of forensic psychology. His interviews with FBI Special Agents John Douglas and Robert Ressler, conducted in the late 1970s and early 1980s as part of the Bureau's landmark Criminal Personality Research Project, were foundational contributions to the development of modern criminal profiling methodology, and the insights Kemper provided about his own psychological processes, his victim selection criteria, his methods of approach and control, and internal experience of committing murder have been cited in virtually every major work on criminal psychology published in the subsequent decades. He cooperated with these interviews with an eagerness and a generosity that Douglas and Ressler later described as remarkable, providing detailed and nuanced accounts of his crimes and his psychology that were, in their combination of self-awareness, articulateness, and complete absence of genuine remorse, among the most valuable and most disturbing contributions to the understanding of serial murder ever recorded. He has also volunteered for the California Department of Corrections Reading Program for Blind, recording audiobooks, activity that has generated a complex mixture of responses from criminologists, victims, advocates, and members of the public, some of whom have argued that the program represents a constructive use of an imprisoned individual's capabilities, and some of whom have found the idea of Edmund Kemper's voice being introduced into the homes and the ears of blind readers, without their knowledge of who he is and what he has done, deeply and understandably troubling. He has been considered for parole on multiple occasions and has, by various accounts, actively discouraged his own parole hearings, reportedly expressing to those who have inquired about his attitude toward release that he is aware of the danger he would represent outside prison, and that he does not wish to be released. Whether this expression of self-awareness and restraint represents a genuine and stable psychological transformation, a strategic performance calculated to manage his image and his conditions of confinement, or some combination of both, is something that cannot be determined with certainty from the outside, and the complexity of the question reflects the complexity of the man himself, a complexity that makes Edmund Kemper one of the most enduringly fascinating and most enduringly disturbing figures in the entire history of American criminal psychology. The victims of Edmund Kemper, his grandmother, shot at a kitchen table while working a crossword puzzle. The young women whose trust in the essential safety of hitchhiking in the California sunshine was exploited with deliberate and systematic precision. His mother, whose decades of contempt and humiliation became, in the end, the organizing principle of a killing spree, deserved to be remembered not as supporting characters in the story of a killer whose intelligence and articulateness have made him a subject of perpetual criminological interest, but as human beings whose lives had value and whose deaths represented losses of a magnitude that no amount of subsequent scholarly insight or investigative utility can adequately acknowledge or redeem. The story of Edmund Kemper is ultimately not the story of a brilliant and self-aware criminal whose psychological insights helped build the science of criminal profiling, though it is that too. It is a story of what happens when a child has failed so completely and so consistently by every adult and every institution that should have protected him, that the damage done becomes irreparable, and of the terrible cost that the people who cross his path paid for failures that were not their own. It is a story without heroes and without redemption, and its proper conclusion is not fascination but grief. Grief for the lives taken, grief for the failures that made those takings possible, and grief for the recognition that the systems we rely on to identify and contain such dangers remain, decades after Edmund Kemper first demonstrated their inadequacy, imperfect in ways that continue to cost lives.